Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you guys are, or whenever you watch this video. Yes. Hi, guys. Alright, I think no further ado, I didn't think we should waste too much time yapping like I did yesterday. I think we should start right away. Also, it's a shame. Yesterday, I think my stream went down when I was reading chapter 3, and I didn't even realize the stream went down. So, my VOD is like 2 videos for my chapter 1 to chapter 5, which is, I don't know, I hate it. And I don't even know how much content was lost in chapter 3, but I can't reread it. So, you gotta do with what you have. Alright. A sip of tea. And then we're gonna start. So today we are continuing それから by Natsume Sōseki. And then by Natsume Sōseki. Okay, let's start now. Chapter 6. Chapter 6 of And Then by Natsume Sōseki. That day, Seigo would not readily agree to lending him the money. For his part, Daisuke avoided whining about how pitiable Michiyo was, or how touching her situation. Even if he himself had such feelings towards her, it would take no ordinary effort to lead his brother, who knew nothing, to that point. Besides, if he were to rashly mouth sentimental phrases, his brother would be scornful. As it was, Seigo seemed to find him a trifle ridiculous. So Daisuke went on in his usual aimless way, wandering from one point to another as he drank. And as he drank, he thought that this was what his father meant by his lack of zeal. But he prided himself on not being so vulgar as to attempt to persuade people with tears. If anything was offensive, it was affected tears, anguish, earnestness, or zeal. His brother also understood this. Hence, if Daisuke were to use such ploy and fail, he would forever lower himself in his brother's eyes. Daisuke gradually moved away from the issue of money. He touched upon such topics as would make them both feel that it was only because they were there, face to face, that they had been able to drink so pleasantly. But when it came time to have their rice and tea, Daisuke suddenly asked, as if he had just remembered it, if Seigo wouldn't find Hiraoka's a position in his company even if he wouldn't lend him money. No, I don't want to have anything to do with people like that. Besides, business is bad, there's nothing I can do. The next morning, Daisuke's first thought upon waking was that only a business colleague could persuade Seigo. It did no good to appeal to him as a brother. After he had determined as much, however, it still did not occur to him to regard his brother as particularly unsympathetic. Indeed, he felt that Seigo had given the appropriate response. Strangely enough, this same brother had willingly paid off the money that Daisuke had dissipated. What if Daisuke were now to affix his seal beside Hiraoka's and go into joint debt? Would Seigo clean it up as he had before? Had his brother in fact been anticipating as much when he refused? Or was he confident that he, Daisuke, would never try such a thing and therefore had not lent him the money? Judging from Daisuke's current tendencies, anyone would think it most unlikely for him to affix his seal for another person. Daisuke himself thought so. But if Seigo had seen through this and in refusing to lend his younger brother the money was gambling on Daisuke's acting in character, then Daisuke was not immune to the temptation of doing the unexpected and seeing how his brother would react. Having gotten this far, Daisuke himself found his thoughts rather ill-natured and mentally gave himself a sarcastic smile. But one thing was certain, sooner or later, Hiraoka would come, loan note in hand, seeking Daisuke's seal. With these thoughts, Daisuke got out of bed. Kadono had been sitting cross-legged reading the newspaper, but as soon as he saw Daisuke coming from the bath with wet hair, he sat up and folded the papers away beside the cushion. "It's really something, isn't it? What's happening in Smoke?" he said loudly. What have you been reading? Have you been reading it? Yes, every morning. Is it interesting? Yes, it seems very interesting somehow. In what way? In what way? I can't answer when you ask like that, Sensei. So formal and all. Well, does it seem like it really shows that modern anxiety? And doesn't it smell of the flesh? Yes, it does. A good deal. Daisuke fell silent. Teacup in hand, he went into the study and sat down. As he gazed vacantly at the garden, he noticed that the young shoots were springing in profusion from the knobby dead branches and roots of the pomegranate. Their color was like a mixture of dark and green and dark red. They flashed for an instant in his eyes, then immediately lost their effectiveness as a stimulus. There was nothing concrete in Daisuke's head in the moment. It was just quietly at work, almost like weather outside. But an infinite number of undefinable particles were pushing against each other in the back of his mind. No matter how much the particles of mold in a piece of cheese move about, the motion goes undetected so long as the cheese remains stationary. Similarly, Daisuke himself barely noticed the seismographic movement taking place in his head. It was just that each time they provoked a psychological response, he was forced to shift in his seat. Thought it went without saying that he was modern. Secondly, he clung steadfastly to the belief that modernity did not necessarily cause anxiety. Daisuke explained the anxiety depicted in Russian literature by the climate and the oppressive political system. He saw the anxiety in French literature as a product of the prevalence of adultery, the anxiety in Italian literature as represented in D'Annunzio. He judged to be the sense of self-loss resulting from uninhibited decadence. Thus, when Japanese writers chose to depict society exclusively from the angle of anxiety, Daisuke regarded it as an importation. In his school days, Daisuke had indeed had some experience with the kind of anxiety that follows upon intellectual doubt. But after developing to a certain point, this anxiety had come to an abrupt halt and then begun to reverse itself. It was as if he had thrown a rock at heaven. He wished he hadn't done it in the first place. The doubt of all things visible, so dear to the heart of Zen priests, belonged to a land in which he had yet to set foot. Daisuke was far too cleverly made to doubt everything with such sincere impetuosity. Daisuke, too, had been reading the newspaper's Zero Smoke, which Kadono had praised. Today, oh my god, I forgot. Hello, welcome. Today, he put the newspaper beside his teacup. He did not even feel like opening it. All the D'Annunzio's heroes were men without money worries, so it was not unreasonable that their excesses should lead to folly. When it came to the hero of Smoke, there was no such leeway. That he should push so far, this notwithstanding, must mean that he was under the power of love. It would be impossible otherwise. Yet, neither this character, named Yokichi, nor the woman Tomoko gave any indication of being forced outside society because of true love. When he tried to identify the inner force that was driving the two, Daisuke grew skeptical. The hero, who could act so resolutely in such circumstances, was probably not subject to anxiety. It would be much more reasonable to suppose that the seeds of anxiety resided in Daisuke, who would hesitate in such situation. Daisuke had always regarded himself as an original, but he was forced to recognize that Yokichi was far ahead of him in this respect. He had started reading Smoke out of curiosity, but lately, since he had begun to feel too great a distance between himself and Yokichi, he had let many days go without even scanning the day's installment. From time to time, Daisuke stirred in his chair. He thought that he was completely relaxed. He finished his tea and began to read as usual. For about 2 hours he read steadily, but when he came to the middle of the certain page, he stopped and rested his chin on his hands. He picked up the newspaper, read the day's installment of Smoke. As before, he was out of tune with it. Then he read various articles here and there. Count Okuma was vigorously supporting the dissident students in the Tokyo Highest Commercial School dispute. This was written up in fairly strong language. Whenever he read something like this, to dress when his nephew Seitaro arrived. Cap in hand, he bowed his well-shaped round head before Daisuke and sat down. Is school out already? It's too early. It's not early at all, said Seitaro, laughing and watching Daisuke's face. Daisuke clapped his hands to call the old woman and asked, Seitaro, would you like some hot chocolate? Yes. Daisuke ordered 2 hot chocolate and began to tease Seitaro. Seitaro, your hands have gotten awfully big these days from playing baseballs all the time. They're bigger than your head. Seitaro grinned and rubbed his round head with his right hand. He really did have large hands. I hear Daddy treated you yesterday, Uncle. That's right. I had quite a feast. Thanks to him, my stomach isn't feeling well today. It's nerves again. It's not nerves, it's real. It's all his fault. That's what Daddy said. What did he say? Go to Daisuke's after school and get him to treat you to something. Oh, in return for yesterday? That's right. I treated him today, so it's his turn tomorrow, he said. You came all the way just for that? Yes. You're my brother's son after all, good and shrewd. That's why I'm giving you the hot chocolate. That'll do, won't it? Hot chocolate? You won't drink it? Oh, I'll drink it, all right, but... It turned out that what Seitaro wanted was to be taken to the Ecoin when the sumo tournament opened and to watch matches from the best seats in the center section. Daisuke agreed readily. Then Seitaro, looking happy, and suddenly came out with, even though you loaf around, Uncle, they say you're a really good man. Even Daisuke was a trifle taken aback by this. He lamely answered, Well, you knew that all along. But I heard it for the first time last night from father, protested Seitaro. Evidently, from what Seitaro had to say after Seigo had come home the night before, he and Umeko and their father had undertaken an evaluation of Daisuke. Because the account was that of a child, it was somewhat confused, but since Seitaro was quite intelligent, he remembered some of the precise words even if they were fragmentary. Daisuke's father's assessment apparently was that Daisuke had little promised. His brother had countered with yes, maybe that was so, but he still understood some things rather well. It would be best to leave him alone for a while. It would work out all right. There was no need to worry. He would probably do something one of these days. His sister-in-law had seconded this. She had been to a fortune teller about a week ago, and his judgment was that Daisuke was a man who's sure to stand at the head of others. Therefore, he was bound to be all right. Daisuke had been listening with interest to all these details, from time to time prompting Seitaro with yes, and then? But when he came to the part about the fortune teller, he was genuinely amused. Presently, he changed his clothes, and seeing Seitaro home, went over to Hiraoka's. Hiraoka's house was a good illustration of the tightening squeeze exerted on the middle class by a decade of inflation. It was exceedingly crude, unsightly construction, and Daisuke was especially sensitive to its aesthetics shortcomings. There were only 2 yards between the gate and the entranceway, and the same distance between the gate and the kitchen door. Next to the house, in every direction, stood similarly cramped houses. They were the work of smallest of financiers who, taking advantage of Tokyo's pitiful swelling, schemed to multiply their own meager funds 2 and 3 times by putting up these shabby structures, mementos to the struggle for survival. In today's Tokyo, particularly in the outskirts, such houses were to be found everywhere. Moreover, like flies in summer, they continued to multiply every day at an extraordinary rate. Daisuke had once termed it to the advance of defeat. He regarded these structures as the most accurate symbols of modern Japan. Some of them were covered with the bottoms of kerosene cans patched together like like square fish scale. Not one among their inhabitants was spared in the sound of pillars cracking in the middle of the night. Their holes always have knot holes. Their doors always have knot holes. Their sliding doors were sure to become warped. Those who stored their capital in their heads and tried to live off the monthly interest earned by their mental endeavors invariably burrowed in such places. Hiraoka was one of them. As Daisuke passed the fence, the first thing to catch his eyes were the roof. The murky black of the tile had a singular effect on him, and it seemed that the lustreless slab of dirt could suck in endless quantities of water. In front of the entrance, bits of sawdust from the unpacking still lay scattered about. When he went into the living room, Hiraoka was seated at a desk in the midst of writing a long letter. Michio was on the next room, softly clattering the handles as she opened and closed drawers. A large wicker trunk lay open beside her, and the sleeve of a pretty under-kimono showed halfway. "Sorry, but would he wait a minute?" Hiraoka asked. Daisuke watched the trunk and the under-kimono and the slender hand that occasionally dipped into the trunk, but Michio's face was hidden from his view. Eventually, Hiraoka threw his brush at the table and sat up. He had evidently been grappling with something quite involved, for his ears were red, as well as his eyes, for the matter. "How are you? Thanks for everything the other day. I meant to come and thank you, but I haven't gotten around to it." Hiraoka's words had more of the air of a challenge than an apology. Although he was wearing neither an undershirt nor long drawers, he immediately crossed his legs. Since his collar was not properly drawn together, his chest hair showed a little. "You must not be quite settled yet," Daisuke asked. "Settled? At this rate, I won't be settled for the rest of my life." With these words, he began to smoke hurriedly. Daisuke understood very well why Hiraoka was greeting him in this way. He wasn't striking out at Daisuke, he was striking out at the society, or rather, he was striking out at himself, Daisuke thought, and he even felt sorry. She greeted Daisuke lightly, thanking him for the other day. She sat down and took the red flannel that she had rolled in her hands and placed it in front of her to show Daisuke. "What do you have there?" "It's the baby's kimono. I made it and just haven't gotten around to undoing it. I found it at the bottom of the trunk, so I took it out." She undid the tie strings and opened the sleeves. "Hey, what do you have something like that around for? Tear it up quickly and make some cleaning rags out of it or something." Michio did not answer, but sat with the baby's kimono on her lap, her eyes cast down. "I made it just like yours," she said, and looked at her husband. "You mean this?" Underneath his lined, printed kimono, next to his skin, Hiraoka wore a layer of flannel. "This is no good anymore. It's too hot." For the first time, Daisuke caught a flash of the old Hiraoka. "It's too hot now to wear flannel underneath a lined kimono. Why don't you wear an underkimono?" "Yeah, I just keep wearing this because it's too much trouble to change. I tell him to take it off so I can wash it, but he won't." "No, I'll take it off. I'm pretty sick of it myself." The conversation had finally moved from the dead child. There was even a little more warmth in the air. Hiraoka said that they should have a drink. They hadn't done it in such a long while. Michio said that she would make a few things too, so wouldn't Daisuke please to make himself at home? Her invitation sounded like a plea. Watching her from behind as she left for the next room, Daisuke wished that he could somehow raise the money. Have you found some place to work?" he asked. "Well, yes, I have, and I haven't. If there isn't anything, I'll play around for a while. If I take my time and look, something's bound to turn up." His words were calm, but Daisuke listened. But as Daisuke listened, he could not help feeling that in fact, Hiraoka was in quite a hurry. Daisuke had been planning to report the exchange that had taken place with his brother the day before, but hearing these words, he decided to put it off for the time being. It would seem as if he were deliberately wrecking the defense that Hiraoka had erected. Moreover, Hiraoka himself had said not a word about the money to him. Therefore, there was no need to say anything explicit. Yet, if he just remained silent, Hiraoka was sure to resent him inwardly as a heartless fellow. Daisuke, though, had almost become insensible to such charges, and he thought that, in fact, he was not such a terribly passionate person. If he were to return to Daisuke of 3 or 4 years ago, and evaluate his present self, he might find that he had degenerated. Yet, when his present self looked back at the old Daisuke, it was evident that he had been exaggerating his own moral sense and flinging it about proudly. Rather than painfully contrive to pass off gold plating for solid gold, Daisuke now thought it easier to proffer brass as brass and bear the contempt appropriate to the inferior metal. It was not as if Daisuke had come to content himself with brass because he had suddenly been swept into the eyes of raging storm and had undergone a drastic change of heart from the shock. No, there was no such melodrama behind the change. Simply by using the powers of reasoning and observation so characteristic of him, he had gradually stripped off the gold plating. Daisuke held the most of it had been coated by his father. There was a time when his father had looked like gold to him. Many of his seniors had looked like gold. Anyone who had attained a certain level of education had looked like gold. Therefore, his own gold plating had been all the more painful, and he had been impatient to become solid gold himself. But once his keen eyes penetrated directly in the inner layers of those other people, his efforts suddenly came to seem foolish. Other thoughts crossed Daisuke's mind. If over 3 or 4 years he himself had changed this much, then during the same time Hiraoka must have changed within the limits of his own experience. The old Daisuke, wanting Hiraoka to think well of him, would have managed to do something in these circumstances, even if that had meant fighting with his brother or arguing with his father, and he would have come to Hiraoka to give a word-for-word account of how it had gone. But then again, it was only the old Hiraoka who would have expected this. Now, he probably did not take friends that seriously. So, with only a word or two on the crucial subject, they passed the time in small talk until the sake arrived. Michio held the bottle by the bottom and served. Hiraoka became increasingly talkative as he drank. Sometimes, no matter how drunk he was, his manner did not change at all. At other times, he would become enormously animated and his tone would be charged with pleasure. When this happened, he not only became more loquacious than most drinkers, but he would even raise comparatively serious issues and argue them happily with his partner. It was strange for Daisuke to realize that it was easiest to argue with Hiraoka when he fell into this state. Hiraoka used to say, "Shall we have a drink and show our true colors?" The boundary between the two had moved far from where it had been in those days, and within themselves, each knew that having moved apart, it would be difficult to find a path that would bring them closer together. The day after Hiraoka's arrival in Tokyo, their first encounter in 3 years, each had discovered that the other had already left his side. But today, there was something peculiar. The more he warmed up to his sake, the more the old Hiraoka came out. As the sake brought him around the comfortable point, he seemed to numb himself completely to his present financial predicament, the life ahead of him, its agonies, his discontent, the turmoil at the bottom of his heart. In a single bound, Hiraoka's talk leaped to a lofty plane. Yes, I failed. I failed, but I'm still working. And I plan to work in the future too. You look at my failure and you laugh. Even if you say you don't, it comes down to the same thing. So it doesn't matter. So you laugh. You laugh, but you don't do anything else, see? You're a fellow who takes the world just as it's given. Put it another way, you're incapable of working your will. If you say that you have no will to work, I won't believe you. You're a human after all. I'll bet you always feel as if you're missing something, which proves my point. I couldn't go on living without exerting my will upon the real world and getting some concrete evidence that this world had to some extent become a little more to my liking because I had willed it so. That's where I see the value in my existence. All you do is think. Because all you do is think. You have constructed two separate worlds, one inside your head, one outside. Just the fact that you tolerate this enormous dissonance, why, that's a great intangible failure already. Ask why I've pushed the dissonance outside, whereas you have shoved it into your head, and just because I've pushed it out, the degree of actual failure may be smaller on my part, but you laugh at me. And I can't laugh at you. No, I would love to. But the society says I can't, right? Go ahead and laugh. Even if you laugh at me, I've already laughed at myself. That's a lie. Isn't it, Michio? Michio had been sitting silently all this time, but on this sudden appeal from her husband, she smiled and looked at Daisuke. It's true, isn't it, Michio-san? Said Daisuke, raising his sake cup to be served. No, it's a lie. I don't care what my wife says to defend you. It's a lie. Though, of course, whether you are laughing at other people or at yourself, you do it all in your head. So it's hard to tell whether you are lying or telling the truth. Oh, quit kidding. I'm not kidding. I'm completely serious. Of course, you didn't used to be like that. No, you didn't used to be like that at all. But you're quite a different man today, right, Michio? Anyone can see that Nagai is proud. But to hear the way you have been talking, it sounds like you are the proud one. Hiraoka laughed loudly. Michio took the sake warming bottle to the next room. Picking at the appetizers on the table with his chopsticks, Hiraoka munched noisily with his face down. Soon he lifted his bleary eyes and said, This is the first time in a long while that I've gotten drunk so nicely. But look, you're not feeling that happy, are you? It's unpardonable. I've become the old Hiraoka Tsunejiro, and you won't become the old Nagai Daisuke. That's unpardonable. Come on, try. Drink. I'll drink more myself, so you drink more too. Daisuke recognized in these words as a sincere and naive effort to take him back to his old self, and he was moved. But at the same time, he could not help feeling that he was being begged to give back the bread that he had been eating the day before. When you drink, even though your words sound drunk, your head's usually clear. So I'll go ahead and speak. That's right. That's the old Nagai. Daisuke suddenly did not want to continue. Are you sure your head's steady? He asked. Of course it is. As long as yours is steady, mine's always steady, he said, and looked at Daisuke straight in the eye. Indeed, it was as he said. So Daisuke said, You have been attacking me for quite a bit for not working, and I haven't said anything. I don't say anything because just as you charge, I don't intend to work. Why not? Why not? Well, it's not my fault. That is to say, it's the world's fault, or, to exaggerate a little, it's because the relationship between Japan and the West is no good and I won't work. First of all, there's no other country with such a bad case of beggar's twitch. When do you think all those debts can be paid off? Oh, the foreign currency bonds might get paid, but they aren't the only debts. The point is, Japan can get along without borrowing from the West, but it poses as a first-class power, and it's straining to join the ranks of the first-class powers. That's why in every direction it puts up the facade of the first class of a first-class power and cheats on what's behind. It's like the frog that tried to outdo the cow. Look, Japan's belly is bursting, and see, the consequences are reflected in each of us as individuals. A people so oppressed by the West have no mental leisure. They can't do anything worthwhile. They get an education that's stripped to the bare bone, and they are driven by their noses to the grindstone until they are dizzy. That's why they all end up with nervous breakdowns. Try talking to them. They're usually stupid. They haven't thought about a thing beyond themselves that day and that very instant. They're too exhausted to think about anything else. It's not their fault. Unfortunately, exhaustion of the spirit and deterioration of the body come hand in hand. And that's not all. The decline of morality has set in too. Look where you will in this country and you won't find one square inch of brightness. It's all pitch black. So what difference would it make? What I said or what I did? Me standing alone, all alone in the middle of it. I've always been a loafer. No, I was a loafer even when I was going around with you. In those days, I tried to look a little lively. That's probably why I seemed talented and promising to you. Of course, in Japan's society, if Japan's society were in sound spiritual, moral, and physical health, if it were just to all around good health, then I would still be talented and promising, don't you see? Because then there would be plenty of incentive to shake me out of my inclination to just loaf. But as things are, it's no good. I'd rather be alone. As for your so-called world as it's given, I'll take it as it is and content myself with having contact with just those things that are most suited to me. To go out and bring other people around to my way of thinking, that's something that can't be done. Daisuke paused for an instant. Then he turned to Michio, who sat looking somewhat uncomfortable, and coaxed. What do you think, Michio-san, about my idea? Isn't it nice and easygoing? Won't you be on my side? In a way, it sounds pessimistic, and in a way, it sounds easygoing. It's strange. I don't understand very well, but it seems like you are cheating a little. Oh? Where? Where? Well, don't you think? And Michio turned to her husband. Hiraoka had been sitting silently with his elbows on his thigh and chin on his hands. Without saying a word, he put his sake cup before Daisuke. Daisuke received it silently. Michio filled their cups again. Touching the cups to his lips, Daisuke felt there was no need to say more. To begin with, he was not arguing for the sake of bringing Hiraoka around to see his viewpoint, nor had he come to be lectured by Hiraoka. Since he realized from the start that the two were destined to stand apart, he had tried to tie up the argument at a reasonable point and bring the conversation around to more common social topics in which Michio could join. But Hiraoka became stubborn when drunk. Thrusting out his chest, and which was flushed to the roots of his hair, he said, "That's interesting, very interesting. People like me who tackle a part of reality and struggle with it don't have time to think up things like that. Japan might be poor, it might be weak, but I forget about that when I'm working. Society might be degenerating, but I don't notice it. I keep busy in the middle of it. Oh, I suppose that the poverty of Japan or the degeneracy of people like me might disturb a man of leisure like you. But that's the kind of thing that a man who's got nothing to do with the rest of the society, a spectator, can say. In other words, it's because you have the time to look at your own face in the mirror that you have come up with things like that. People forget their faces when they are busy." Oh God, I love this. Hiraoka had naturally hit upon this metaphor as he talked, and feeling as if he had found a great ally, he paused triumphantly. Daisuke had no choice but to smile weakly. Hiraoka picked up immediately. What's wrong with you that you have never had to worry about money? You don't feel like working because you don't have to in order to make ends meet. In other words, you are still little Master Daisuke. That's why you keep on saying these nice, refined things. At this point, Daisuke found Hiraoka a trifle provoking and cut him short. It's fine to work, but as long as you're going to work, it ought to be for more than subsistence, else it won't be to your credit. All toil that is sacred transcends the realm of bread. All toil that is sacred transcends the realm of bread. Hiraoka studied Daisuke's face with strangely unpleasant eyes. Then he asked, Why? Why? Because toil for the sake of subsistence is not toil for its own sake. I can't understand that. It sounds like proposition from a logic textbook. Can't you put it in terms a practical man can understand? I mean, that it's hard to work sincerely at a job that you are doing just to eat. I think just the opposite. It's because you are working to eat that you feel like working furiously. Maybe you can work furiously, but it's hard to work sincerely. If you are working in order to eat, which do you think is the main object? Work or food? Food, of course. See? If food's the object and work of the means, then it stands to reason that you adjust your work to make it easier to eat. In that case, it won't matter. But what you do or how you do it, as long as you can get bread, that's what it's bound to come down to. As long as the content and direction or the procedure of a given endeavor are circumscribed by external conditions, then that the endeavor is degenerate endeavor. That sounds pretty theoretical again, but why should that matter? Then let me explain to you with a very refined example. This might sound a little musty, but I remember reading it in a book. Oda Nobunaga once hired a famous cook. The first time he ate something prepared by the cook, he thought it tasted terrible. So he gave the cook a sound scolding. After that, the cook who had been punished for serving his finest dishes would only make second or third-rate dishes, and he was always praised. Now, take this cook. He might have been very screwed as far as working for a living went, but as for working for his art, which was cooking, why, he was insincere. He was a degenerate cook. But if he hadn't done that, he would have been fired. He couldn't help it. That's what I'm saying. Unless you are a man without worries about food and clothing, doing something on a whim, as it were, it's impossible to do any serious work. So, that means only a man in your position is capable of sacred toil. Then it's your duty all the more to do something, right, Michio? Yes, that's true. It seems that we are right back where we started. That's why arguments are no good, said Daisuke, scratching his head. The argument over at last. Whoa. That's a chapter to think about. What you do on a daily basis, huh? Do you work for a living or do you live for work? Will you sincerely do your work if it's not for the bread that it provides? Or do you work sincerely at your work because you like the work that you're doing? This is why I like Natsume Sōseki's books. And it's always relevant no matter which century that we are in. Alright, that was chapter 6. We're gonna go to chapter 7 now. one sip of tea. Okay. Alright. Chapter 7. We're currently reading Natsume Sōseki's And Then, それから Chapter 7. Daisuke was taking a bath. How's the temperature, sensei? Shall I heat it up a little bit? Kadono popped his head at the door. He was quite attentive to these matters. Soaking in the water, Daisuke remained motionless. This is fine, he answered. Is it? Kadono said abruptly and returned to the morning room. Daisuke found Kadono's response terribly interesting and grinned broadly to himself. Daisuke had the sensibility that registered perceptions unknown to most people. He occasionally suffered agonizing experiences on account of it. One moment, please. Sorry. I'm back, sorry. Alright. Daisuke had a sensibility that registered perceptions unknown to most people. He occasionally suffered agonizing experiences on account of it. Once, when a friend's father died, he had attended the funeral. He happened to glance at his friend in formal attire, following the coffin with a green bamboo stick. The sight struck him as so funny he did not know what to do. Another time, listening to his father's lecture, he had unwittingly looked at the old man's face and was seized by an uncontrollable desire to burst out laughing. In the days before he had his own bath, he used to go to a neighborhood's bathhouse where there was one unusually muscular attendant. Whenever Daisuke went, this fellow would come dashing out from the back crying, "Let me wash you down!" and proceed to rub his back. Each time he had his back scrubbed by this fellow, Daisuke felt as if it were being done by an Egyptian. Try as he would, he could not picture the man as a Japanese. There were other strange things. The other day he had discovered in his readings that a physiologist named Weber could accelerate and decelerate his heartbeat at will. Daisuke, who was in the habit of examining his heartbeat anyway, was tempted to try it. But when he was at the point of making 2 or 3 timid attempts a day, he began to feel that he was becoming like Weber. Startled by the thought, he abruptly halted his investigation. Daisuke, who had been quietly soaking in the water, mechanically lifted his right hand to his left breast. No sooner he had heard the throbbing of life 2 or 3 times, then he remembered Weber and immediately got out of the bathtub. There, sitting cross-legged on the floor, he stared absently at his legs. They began to look strange. They no longer seemed to grow from his trunk at all, but rather completely unconnected. They sprawled rudely before him. When he got this far, he realized something that he had never noticed before, that his legs were unbearably hideous, with hair growing unevenly and blue streaks running rampant. They were terribly strange creatures. Daisuke got into the tub again and wondered if, as Hiroka had said, such thoughts came to him because he had entirely too much time on his hands. When he left the bath and looked at his form in the mirror, he recalled Hiroka's words again. Now, it was time to shave his cheeks with the broad western razor. The sight of the sharp blade gleaming in the mirror aroused a ticklish sensation in him. Pressed by the knowledge that if the sensation become more acute, he would feel as if he were looking down from a high tower. He finally managed to finish shaving. Just as he was about to pass through the morning room, he heard the words, "Sensei is pretty crafty somehow." It was Kadono talking to the old woman. "What do you mean crafty?" Daisuke stopped and looked at Kadono. Kadono answered, "Oh, you are out already, Sensei. That was quick." Given this greeting, Daisuke could not very well repeat "What do you mean crafty?" So he went straight back to his study and sat in a chair and rested. As he rested, it occurred to him that it could not be good for his health to have his mind working in such odd ways. Perhaps he should do a little traveling. For one thing, it would be a convenient way of avoiding marriage issue that had been reared in his head again. But then, Hiroka still weighed on his mind, and he quickly erased all thought of seeking a change of air. When pursued the matter further, it became clear that it was Michio, not Hiroka, who weighed in his mind. But even when he had pursued this issue this far, Daisuke did not feel the slightest qualms. On the contrary, he felt rather elated. It was 4 or 5 years ago, when he was still a student, that Daisuke had become acquainted with Michio. In those days, because of the Nagai family standing, Daisuke was familiar with a number of names and faces of the young women who had risen to the surface of society. But Michio was not among them. One would have said that in appearance she was more sober and in spirit more subdued than they were. In those days, Daisuke had a school friend named Suganuma, who was on friendly terms with both Daisuke and Hiroka. Michio was his younger sister. This Suganuma was from a neighboring prefecture, and in the spring of his second year at the university, he brought his sister out from the country to further her education. He immediately left his old boarding house, and the two set up housekeeping. At the time, his sister had just graduated from the girls' higher school. The story was that she was 18, or thereabouts. She wore fine, bright collars, and shoulder tucks. Soon, she began to commute to a girls' school. Suganuma's house was in the Shimizu-zucho in Yanaka. That was difficult to pronounce. Shimizucho. Suganuma's house was in Shimizucho in Yanaka. God damn, Japanese. Shimizucho. Suganuma's house was in Shimizucho's in Yanaka. Damn. There was no garden, but instead, from the veranda, there was a view of the old cedars of the Ueno forest. These had a singularly mysterious color, like rusted iron. One of them was half dead and all but bare at the top. Towards evening, many crows came to perch and cry. Next door, there lived a young artist. They were on the narrow side of the street, where even rickshaws seldom passed. it was an extremely quiet dwelling. Daisuke went to visit often. The first time he met Michiyo, she retreated with just a bow. Daisuke appraised the view of Ueno Forest and went home. The second and even the third time he went, all Michiyo did was to serve tea. But it was a small house and she could only have been in the next room. As he talked to Suganuma, Daisuke could not help being conscious that Michiyo was in the next room, listening to what he said. Daisuke's memory had kept no record of the occasion that had led to him to start talking to Michiyo. It must have been that trifling and ordinary an incident, for Daisuke, sated with poems and novels, this had made it all the more interesting. But once they began to talk, the two became friendly, just as in all the poems and novels. Like Daisuke, Hiraoka had often gone to visit the Suganumas. There were occasions when the two had set out together, and just about the same time as Daisuke, Hiraoka became acquainted with Michiyo. At times, Michiyo had tagged along when her brother and the two young men went for a walk to the edge of the pond. The four passed slightly less than 2 years in this manner. In the spring of the year Suganuma was to graduate, his mother came out from the country and spent a few nights in Shimizuzo. In Shimizucho. Ah, kill me. Shimizucho. 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 I'm sorry. It's difficult. Shimizucho. You have to separate it. Shimizucho. It was the mother's custom to come to Tokyo once or twice a year and spend 5 or 6 days with her children. This time, however, she began running a fever the day before her departure and could not move. A week later, her case was diagnosed as typhus, and she was taken immediately to the university hospital. Michiyo moved in to take care of her. The patient's progress was satisfactory at first, but midway she suffered a setback and in the end died. That was not all. Michiyo's brother, who had visited his mother, also contracted typhus and died not long after. Only their father was left at home in the country. Since he came out both when their mother died and when Suganuma died to make the necessary arrangement, the father became acquainted with the two young men who had been deeply involved with the deceased. When the time came for him to take Michiyo home, he took his daughter and called at their respective boarding house to thank them and bid them farewell. That fall, Hiraoka married Michiyo. It was Daisuke who had arranged everything between them. Officially, a senior alumnus from the home province was asked to fill the role of a go-between at the ceremony, but it was Daisuke who had actually busied himself and made the necessary arrangement for Michiyo. Shortly after the wedding, the couple left Tokyo. Unexpected circumstances at home forced Michiyo's fathers to leave, and he ended up going to Hokkaido. Michiyo had been placed in a somewhat forlorn situation. Daisuke wanted to somehow make it possible for her to settle down in Tokyo. He thought that perhaps he should try consulting his sister-in-law again to devise some means of raising the money. He also thought of seeing Michiyo and asking her for more intimate details of the situation. But even if he went over to Hiraoka's, Michiyo was not a woman to rashly wash her dirty linen before the others. Besides, even if he were able to obtain the details behind their present indebtedness, it would still be no easy matter to probe the depth of the couple's relationship, and that, Daisuke was forced to admit when he looked into his heart, was precisely the true focus of his interest. To be honest, therefore, he had already bypassed the need to learn why they wanted the money. It made no difference whether he knew such superficial details or not. He wanted to lend Michio the money and make her content, but he had not the slightest intention of raising the sum in order to win her favor. Daisuke could no longer afford to be so calculating with Michio. Moreover, it would be difficult to chance upon a time when Hiraoka was absent and he could get a full account of their circumstances, even those particularly relating only to finances. It went without saying that as long as Hiraoka was at home, there could be no intimate discussion. Even if there were, Daisuke would of course not be able to accept all the details at face value. Hiraoka, prompted by various worldly motives, maintained a display of pride before Daisuke. Even where such display was unnecessary, he, for some reason, guarded his silence. Daisuke decided that in any case, he would consult his sister-in-law first. Yet he felt himself that the prospects were extremely dim. He had time and again harassed her with the request for trifling sums, but never before he confronted her so brashly. But Umeko had some funds at her disposal, so it was not absolutely certain that nothing would come out of the request. If that did not work, he might even go to the moneylender. But he was not yet inclined to go that far. If, however, Hiraoka was sooner or later going to press him into formal joint liability, and he was to find himself unable to refuse, then it was far more pleasant to take the initiative himself and please Michio directly. This direct decision, reached without the help of reason, had already settled somewhere in Daisuke's head. There was a warm, humid wind blowing on the day he chose to visit his sister-in-law. Sometime after 4 o'clock, as the cloudy weather hung lazily in the sky without any sign of clearing, Daisuke left his home and took the streetcar to his brother's house. Just before the Aoyama Palace, his father and brother passed on the left, hurrying their special speed rickshaws. Since they passed too quickly even to exchange nods, the two of them, of course, had not noticed him. Daisuke got off at the next stop. As he entered the gate to his brother's house, the sound of the piano came from the drawing room. Daisuke paused for an instant on the gravel, then immediately cut to the left and went around to the kitchen entrance. There, outside the grating, a large English dog named Hector lay asleep, with a leather muzzle over his mouth. As soon as he heard Daisuke step, Hector shook his long-haired ears and sharply lifted his spotted face. Then he moved his tail. Daisuke looked into the houseboy's room at the side of the entrance, said a few pleasantries from the threshold, and went straight into the western room, where he opened the door to find his sister-in-law seated at a piano. At her side stood Nuiko, wearing a long-sleeved kimono, her hair hanging to her shoulders. Every time he saw her hair, Daisuke recalled the sight of Nuiko on the swing. Her black hair, light pink ribbon, and yellow crepe sash had caught the wind all at once and looked as if they floated in the air. The image was carved vividly in his mind. Mother and daughter turned around at once. "Well?" Nuiko came running over without a word. He grabbed his hand and dragged him forward. Daisuke found himself beside the piano. "I wonder who the great master was." Without a word, Umeko, her brows knitted, smiled and waved her hands to cut him short. "Dai-san, you play this part and show us." Daisuke silently took his sister-in-law's place. With his eyes on the notes, he skillfully worked his fingers for a while and then said, "That's about right, isn't it?" and quickly left the seat. For some 30 minutes, mother and daughter took turns at the instrument, reviewing the same passage. Finally, Umeko said, "Let's stop here. Why don't we go over there and eat? You come too, Uncle Daisuke," and stood up. It was already growing dark in the room. Daisuke, who had been listening to the music, watching the white hands of his sister-in-law and niece, and from time to time gazing at the transom painting, had all but forgotten about Michio and the money that he wanted to borrow. Looking back, as he left the room, he noticed that the area where the ultramarine waves broke and blue-white sprays were clearly visible in the dark. Above these billows, Daisuke pictured a golden cloud peaks flung everywhere. As for the skyline, he completed it skillfully by making the peaks appear, on close inspection, to be giant nude females with streaming hair and leaping bodies, forming a furious frenzied band. Daisuke had wondered this design with the intention of having the clouds suggest Valkyries. In his mind, he had fused together these enormous clusters, indistinguishable neither as cloud peaks nor as giant female forms, and he secretly delighted in them. But once the painting was actually executed and fitted into the wall, it had fallen far short of his imagination. By the time he left the room with Umeko, the Valkyries were barely visible. The ultramarine waves, of course, were not visible at all. Only the large clumps of white foam glimmered palely. The lights had already been lit in the living room. There, Daisuke took his dinner with Umeko and the two children. Daisuke had Seitaro brought him a cheroot from his brother's room, and as he smoked, he made small talk. In time, the children, warned by their mother that they had to prepare their lessons for the next day, retired to their rooms, and Daisuke and Umeko were left face to face. Daisuke thought it would be strange to launch directly into his request, so began his advance from various unrelated points. Where were his father and brother rushing off to in their rickshaws? Seigo had treated him to lunch the other day. Why hadn't Umeko gone to the garden party at Azabu? Father's Chinese poetry was mostly empty talk. In the course of exchanging such questions and answers, Daisuke learned one new fact. It had to do precisely with what he had witnessed earlier. According to Umeko, his brother and father had been conspicuously busy during the past 4 or 5 days, so much so they barely had time to sleep. What on earth was happening? Daisuke asked, his face composed as usual. His sister-in-law likewise responded in a normal manner, saying yes, she supposed something was going on, since neither his father nor his brother told her anything. She didn't know. But anyway, Dai-san, about a bride for you, she began, when the houseboy came in. They were going to be late again. If such and such parties called, tell them to come home to the tea house. The houseboy delivered this telephone message and left. Thinking it would be bothersome to have the conversation return to the marriage issue, Daisuke came straight out and said that, as a matter of fact, he had come to ask for a small favor. Umeko listened to his story obediently. Daisuke took some 10 minutes to recite everything. In conclusion, he said, so why wouldn't you take a chance and lend me the money? Then Umeko, looking serious, said, yes, well, let me see. When do you plan to pay it back? It was a completely unexpected question. Pinching his chin with his fingers, Daisuke silently studied his sister-in-law's manner. Umeko, looking increasingly serious, said, I'm not being sarcastic. You mustn't get angry. Daisuke was of course not angry. He simply had not expected a question like this from his sister-in-law. If at this point he were to elaborate and say yes, he planned to return it, or no, he had actually counted on being given it, things would have become much too absurd. Therefore, he tamely submitted to Umeko's offense. Umeko felt as if she finally had this difficult younger brother in her grasp, and she found it easy to follow up with, Dai-san, you have always looked down on me, haven't you? No, I'm not trying to be disagreeable. It's the truth. It can't be helped, isn't that right? I don't know what to say when you interrogate me like this. So deadly serious. It's all right. You don't have to cover up. I know perfectly well. Why don't you come out and admit this honestly? Unless you do, I can't go on with the rest. Daisuke sat grinning without a word. See? What did I say? But I take it for granted. It doesn't bother me at all. No matter how I strut about, of course, I'm no match for you. You and I are satisfied with our relationship as it's always been, so I won't complain. That's that. But you also look down on your father, don't you? Daisuke was taken aback by the sincerity of her manner, so he answered, Yes, I do look down on him a little. At this, Umeko laughed out loud as if terribly delighted. Then she said, You also look down on your brother? My brother? I respect my brother tremendously. Don't lie. Go ahead and confess it all while you are at it. Well, I don't look down on him in some ways. There, what did I say? You look down on every member of the family. I'm very sorry. You need not. You needn't bother with such apologies. As far as you are concerned, I'm sure we are all deserve to be looked down upon. Why don't we call it quits? You are being awfully hard on me today. No, I mean it. It really doesn't matter. We are not going to fight over this or anything. But anyway, why should a great man like you have to borrow money from someone like me? Isn't it funny? You are probably angry thinking that I'm trying to trip you up in your own words, but that's not it at all. It just so happens that when you don't have money, even a great man like you has to come and bow before a person like me. That's why I've been bowing all this time. You are still not taking me seriously. But this is way out of being serious. Maybe it's also your way of being great. But what will you do if no one lends you the money and you can't help your friends? No matter how great you are, it won't do any good. You are just the same as a rickshaw driver as far as skills go. Daisuke had never expected to receive such pointed criticism from his sister-in-law, but in fact, ever since he had thought of trying to raise the money, he had been dimly aware of this weakness himself. You're right. I'm no better than a rickshaw driver. That's why I've come to ask for your help. What shall we do with you? You are too great. You find the money yourself. I wouldn't mind considering it if you're a real rickshaw driver, but I won't lend to you. You're a little too much, aren't you? Every month you come around to your father and brother for your keep, and now on top of it, you have taken on other people's needs and offered to lend them. Who would be willing to pay for that? Umeko's point was most reasonable. Daisuke had overstepped the reasonable without noticing. Looking back, he saw his sister-in-law and brother and father huddled together. He felt that he too would have to retrace his steps and stand with the rest of the society. Before he left his own house, he had worried that his sister might refuse him the money, but even so, he could never have resolved to work hard and raise the money himself. Daisuke did not take the matter that seriously. Umeko, making most of this opportunity, tried to rouse Daisuke on a score of points. But Daisuke understood very well what she was about. The more he understood, the less inclined he was to be roused. Eventually, the conversation left the topic of money and returned to that of marriage. Since their earlier conversation, Daisuke had been twice harangued by his father on the latest prospect. His father's reasoning was, as always, old-fashioned and obligation-bound, but this time his tactics were not as high-landed as usual. It was a fine thing to cement ties with someone of the same blood of his very lifesaver, said his father. Wouldn't Daisuke accept her? In that way, Nagai Toku could at least repay his obligation in a small way. As far as Daisuke was concerned, it was unclear as to what was so fine, and what constituted the repayment of a debt. It was all utterly illogical. Daisuke had no particular objection to the candidate herself, given that the propriety of his father's reasoning lay beyond the pale of argument. Daisuke did not especially mind marrying the girl if it came to that. Just as he had made it his practice not to place too much weight on anything over the past 2 or 3 years, so he recognized no need to place undue emphasis on marriage. He only knew Sagawa's daughter from a photograph, but he felt that was quite enough. Admittedly, in the photograph she looked rather beautiful. So, if it came to marrying her, he had no intention of putting forth putting forth cumbersome conditions. If it was just that he could not bring himself to actually say yes. Such vacillation, his father would criticize, was the attitude of a blockhead who understood nothing. For his sister-in-law, who regarded marriage as the single crucial event lying between birth and death, to which all the other events were to be subordinated, his attitude was appalling. Surely even you don't plan to stay single all your life. Why don't you quit acting like a spoiled child and make up your mind? Said Umeko, a trifle exasperated. To stay single all his life, or to keep a mistress, or to have relations with geisha, Daisuke himself had no clear plans. The only certain thing was that unlike other single men, he could not get very interested in marriage. This could be traced to the three factors. First, the quality of his disposition, which was such that he could not wholeheartedly concentrate on any one thing. Second, the considerable keenness of his mind, which, given the conditions of contemporary Japan, had been primarily directed to dispelling illusions. And last, the opportunity that relatively unconstrained finances had given him to know quite a number of certain type of women. But Daisuke saw no need to take his analysis this far. While keeping a firm grip on the reality that was evident to him, that he was uninterested in marriage, he simply planned to let the future unfold naturally. Therefore, to set out with the premise that marriage was a necessity and to struggle to realize it at some point was to Daisuke's unnatural, irrational, and moreover, tainted with vulgarity. Of course, Daisuke did not intend to elaborate on this philosophy to his sister-in-law, but sometimes, driven to a corner, he would ask in despair, "But is it absolutely necessary that I get a wife?" Daisuke was of course perfectly serious in asking this, but his sister-in-law was aghast. She would end up interpreting it as Daisuke's making fun of her. That night, after going through the usual procedure with him, Umeko said, "It's strange how much you don't want to get married. You say that it's not that you don't want to, but if you won't get married, it comes to the same thing as you're not wanting to. In that case, there must be someone you like. Why don't you tell me her name?" Of all the prospects thus far, Daisuke could not recall a single one whom he had mentally designated as a woman he liked. But now, confronted with Umeko's question, the name Michio came floating to his mind, and behind it, the words, "That's why I would like you to lend me the money," formed of their own accord. But Daisuke only smiled ironically and sat quietly before his sister. That was chapter 7, and I want to say it's like third fiddle and help Hiraka get married to her, even though he likes her. This is a common theme in Natsume Sōseki's books. The guys are always a bit too shy to tell the girls that they like them. Yeah. And I've been told by a Japanese guy one time that one of the things about Natsume Sōseki is that when he was in England and people ask him, "How do you tell a girl that you like her? You know, like, how do you say I love you or I like you?" And he answered, "Tsuki ga kirei." So it's like he was saying that the moon is beautiful. So at that time they were like, "Oh, okay. So I guess I love you is tsuki ga kirei." But what he's trying to say is that even if a man likes a woman, He wouldn't tell her directly. He would just say, the moon is beautiful, like an idiot. So, please don't be like Natsume Sōseki. Just tell people that you like them. Even if you get rejected, you got your answers and closure. You know? Don't keep it to yourself. That's all I'm saying. Oh man. Give me a second. I'm looking at my gecko. She's very active now. She's exploring her new enclosure. Oh, she's scared. So yeah, guys. Don't be so wishy-washy. Oh god, I'm just yawning. Goodness. Hang on. Yeah. The lesson here, don't be wishy-washy. Just tell people how you feel. Man. It's not that hard. Okay. Okay. Yep, I knew the way he's going to do everything. It's just very obvious that he likes Michio. It's always a love triangle and the love triangle is like the other two is always married to each other, and then the OP sorry, the main OP. I'm too much of a redditor. The main character is always like, well, oh well, I guess I'll just like, just be a bachelor forever because I couldn't get the girl I like. Duh. Okay, alright, let's go. Chapter 8. Guys, we can do it. I'm planning to do at least to chapter 10 today. It's about half an hour per chapter, so I think it's fine. All's good, guys. I thought I could do more than 10 chapters. I mean, 5 chapters today, but I don't know. I don't know if I could. Maybe if I finish work early tomorrow, I can start tomorrow at 6 o'clock actually. My work ends at 6. So Actually, I think I can continue reading tomorrow. If I read 2 hours a day, then I could finish the book by Monday or something. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see. Okay. Alright. That was a little bit of a stretch and rest there. Alright. Okay. We are currently reading Natsume Sōseki's and then それから それから Chapter 8 Chapter 8 of それから by Natsume Sōseki. The night was late by the time Daisuke left for home without having succeeded with his sister-in-law. So late, in fact, that he barely managed to catch the last streetcar from Aoyama. Even so... One moment, please. Even so, all the while he was talking, neither his father nor brother came home. Umeko was called to the telephone twice. Since there was nothing unusual in her manner, Daisuke had not bothered to ask after them. That night, the sky, which threatened rain, seemed to have taken on the color of earth. As he waited all alone by the red pole marking, the streetcar stopped. A small ball of fire appeared in the distance. It struck him as a terribly forlorn as it flickered up and down, heading straight towards him. When he got on, he found himself the only passenger. Sandwiched between the black-garbed conductor and the driver, he moved on, buried in a certain kind of sound, and saw that everything was black outside the moving train. Seated all alone in the spotlight, Daisuke felt as if he might ride on, and in the end, without having the chance to get off, be dragged along forever. When he got off at Kagurazaka, the deserted road, hemmed in by two-storied houses on either side, closed in long and narrow before him. He was halfway up. The road began to reverberate. Daisuke thought that it must be the wind hitting the ridges of the houses. He stopped and looked up at the dark eaves. He swept his eyes from the roofs to the sky. He was suddenly overcome with a kind of terror. The rattling of the doors, glass panels, and the shoji becomes furious, and by the time he said to himself, "It's an earthquake," his legs, though still standing, were bent double. At that instant, he thought that the two-storied houses would come toppling down from both sides and bury the hill. Just then, a small side door burst open and a man came out carrying a child, shouting, "It's an earthquake! It's an earthquake! It's a huge earthquake!" Hearing the man's voice, Daisuke felt reassured at last. When he got home, the old woman and Kadono were full of talk about the earthquake, but Daisuke thought that neither of them could have felt it as he had. When he got into bed, he tried once more to think of how he should handle Michio's request, but he did not go so far as to tax his mind. He tried to guess what lay behind his father's and brother's recent extreme activities. He resolved to continue to vacillate on the marriage question, and finally he fell asleep. The next day, the so-called Japan Sugar Company incident appeared on the newspaper for the first time. The report was that the executive of Sugar Refinery had used company funds to bribe several members of the Diet. Kadono, as usual, found it thrilling that business executives and politicians were being taken into custody, but Daisuke could not find it all that thrilling. In 2 or 3 days, as the number of those under investigation increased, people began to clamor as if it were a major scandal. One paper even termed it as "Roundup for England." The explanation went that the British ambassador had bought up the Japan sugar stock and lost on it. When he began to register his dissatisfaction, the Japanese government had embarked on this course to mollify him. shortly before the Japan sugar incident, a firm called the Oriental Steamship Company had reported loss of 800,000 yen in 6 months period following payment of a 12% dividend. Daisuke remembered this incident. He also remembered that at the time, the newspapers had questioned the credibility of the report. Daisuke knew nothing about the firm with which his father and brother were associated, but he had always thought that something could happen any day. But he did not believe that his father and brother were blameless in every respect. He even wondered if, under strict scrutiny, they might not both qualify for investigation. Even if it did not go that far, he certainly would not affirm that their fortunes had been made by sheer skill and daring. In the early days of the Meiji period, the government, in order to encourage immigration to the Yokohama area, had offered free land. There were people today who enjoyed considerable wealth because of the free land they had received at the time. This belonged to the category of heaven-bestowed good fortune. But men like his father and brother, thought Daisuke, built their own hothouses in which they could artificially and moreover calculatingly go about creating a good fortune that would benefit only themselves. With thoughts such as this, Daisuke was not particularly surprised by the newspaper's reports, nor was he so honest as to worry about his father's and brother's company. Only Michio weighed on his mind somewhat. But to go to her empty-handed was disagreeable. He resolved to do something in the near future, and then he spent 4 or 5 days immersed in his readings. Strangely enough, he heard not a word from either Hiraoka or from Michio about the money. In his heart, Daisuke thought that Michio might come alone to get his answer, and he waited expectantly. But the waiting was in vain. In the end, he began to be beset by ennui. Wondering if there might not be some place where he could divert himself, he began to look through the entertainment guides and thought of going to a play. He took the Sotobori line from Kagurazaka, but by the time he got to Ochanomizu, he changed his mind and decided instead to visit an old classmate named Terao in Morikawacho. This fellow, upon graduation, had announced that since he did not want to teach, he was going to make literature his business. Heedless of the warnings of those around him, he had launched out a risky venture. 3 years had gone by, but he had yet to make his name. Gasping and panting, he continued to make his living by writing. Daisuke, pressed to write something, anything for a magazine for which Terao was associated, had once sent in a humorous piece. For 1 month it had laid exposed to the elements to the stands of the front of magazine shops, and then was doomed to disappear forever from the world of man. Since then, Daisuke had refused to pick up his brush. Every time he saw Daisuke, Terao urged him to write again, never failing to add, "Look at me." But report had it that he was actually on the verge of giving up. He was partial to Russian works, especially those by writers whom others had never heard of, and his vice was to spend his last penny on a newly published book. Once, when he had become too bombastic, Daisuke had teased that as long as writers were obsessed with Russia, they would never get anywhere. It was impossible to talk with those who hadn't gotten beyond the Russo-Japanese War. Looking serious, Terao had answered that he was willing to do battle at any time, but simply to ascend to paradise a post-war Japan had done was terribly dull. It might be cowardly, but it was still safer to be afflicted with the passion for Russia. Thus, Terao persisted in championing Russian literature. Going in from the entranceway, Daisuke found Terao seated at a lacquered desk in the middle of the room, a towel tied around his head. "A headache," he said. Sleeves rolled up, working on a manuscript for imperial literature. Daisuke offered to come home another day if he was busy, but Terao answered no, there was no need to leave. He had already done here. He paused to calculate. 5 times 5, 2 yen and 50 cents worth of work since morning. Presently, he took off the towel and began to talk. almost immediately commencing to rail with a ferocity that all but took one's breath away at contemporary Japanese writers and critics. Daisuke listened, entertained, but he secretly thought that Terao was engaging in mudslinging because no one would praise him. Why not publish some of those views, he urged. That wouldn't do, Terao laughed. Ask why not. He refused to answer. After a while, he came back with, of course, if he were in Daisuke's shoes and had an easy life, he would not hesitate to speak out. As it was, he had to eat after all. It wasn't a serious business anyway. That was all right. He should just do his best, encouraged Daisuke. It wasn't all right at all, answered Terao. He was very much wanted to do something serious. How about it? Didn't Daisuke feel like lending him a little money and making a serious fellow out of him? No. When the time came that Terao felt that he was being serious doing just the kind of thing that he was now doing, then he would lend him money, teased Daisuke. With these words, he stepped outside. He came out to the street in Hongo, but feeling of ennui was the same as ever. No matter where he wandered, he felt unsatisfied, and he lost the urge to visit. Examining himself, he realized that his whole body felt as if it had turned into an enormous upset stomach. He thought the streetcar from 4th Street and arrived at Densuin-mae. Each time the train shook, he felt as if something rotten inside his 5-foot-plus upset stomach was pulsating in waves. It was past 3 when he listlessly meandered home. Kadono met him at the door, saying, "There was a messenger from your home. I left the letter on your desk in the study. I signed the receipt for myself." The letter was in old-fashioned message case. Nothing, not even the addressee's name, was written on its red exterior. It was marked with black ink, where the narrow folds had been sealed and pushed through a brass ring. Daisuke took one look at the top of his desk and knew the sender to be his sister-in-law. There was no mistaking Umeko's quaint taste, from time to time found unexpected expression. Poking at the sealed fold with scissors, Daisuke thought she had gone to troublesome lengths. But the letter within was just an opposite of its container. It was simple, colloquial, and to the point. She was sorry that she had been unable to comply with his request the other day when he had taken the trouble to come over. Looking back, she was disturbed that she had been so forward and rude. She hoped that he would not think badly of her. But she was giving him the money. Though she couldn't quite manage the entire sum, she had put together just 200 yen. He should take it to his friends right away. This was to be kept a secret from his father, from his brother, so he should bear that in mind. She had not forgotten the question about his wife, so he should think his answer over carefully. Rolled inside the letter was a check for 200 yen. As he looked at it, Daisuke began to feel apologetic towards Umeko. On his way out the other night, she had asked, didn't he need the money then? When he had thrust the request at her, he had flung it back sharply, yet when he had given up and was about to leave, she had anxiously sought his reassurance. Daisuke saw in her behavior both the beauty and frailty of women, and he lost the heart to take advantage of such weakness, because he could not bear to trifle with such beautiful frailty. Saying no, he didn't need it. Things would probably work out somehow. He had left. No doubt Umeko had thought that a cruel response. It must have been those cold words that had caught somewhere behind her normal resoluteness and led to this letter. Daisuke answered immediately. He tried to express his great gratitude as warmly as possible. Daisuke never felt such inclinations towards his brother, nor towards his father, nor naturally towards society at large, and lately he had seldom felt this way even towards Umeko. Daisuke thought of going to Michio's place right away, but the fact was 200 yen was an odd sum. He even thought that as long as she was going to give him this much, she should have gone all the way and satisfied him completely by giving him what he had asked for to begin with. But this thought came to him only when his mind turned from Umeko to Michio. And for Daisuke, who believed that all women, even the most resolute, wavered when it came to matters of heart, Umeko's action did not seem to cause for complaint. Indeed, insofar as it was indicative of a more expansive sympathy, he found the attitude more agreeable than the transigency of men. If it had been his father instead of Umeko who had sent the 200 yen, Daisuke would have seen it as an instance of financial wavering and doubtless would have found it more disagreeable. Daisuke went out without eating dinner. He followed the banks of the Edogawa River to Gokencho, and by the time he crossed the river, the spiritual fatigue that had beset him during the afternoon walk had lifted. Climbing the hill and coming out of the sight of Dentsuin, he came upon a tall, narrow chimney, spewing dirty smoke from between the temples into the cloudy sky. The labored breathing of a puny industrial force struggling to survive was unsightly to Daisuke. He could not help half-consciously associating this chimney with Hiraoka, who lived nearby. At such times, his aesthetic sense always took precedence over his sympathy. Daisuke was so affected by the wretched coal smoke dispersing into the sky that for an instant he all but forgot Michio. In Hiraoka's doorway, a pair of women's sandals lay where they had been flung off. When Daisuke opened the grating, Michio came out from the back, letting her hem rustle softly. It was already dark in the cramped vestibule. Michio sat down and greeted him from the midst of the darkness. At first, he could not seem to tell who it was, but as soon as he heard Daisuke's voice, she said rather low that she had wondered who it was. Daisuke gazed at Michio's indistinct form and found it more beautiful than usual. Hiraoka was absent. When he heard this, Daisuke found it at once easier and harder to go on talking. It was a peculiar feeling, but Michio, for her part, was as composed as ever. The two sat together without even lighting a lamp or opening up the dark room. Michio said that the maid was also out. She herself had been out to do an errand and had just finished her dinner. Eventually, Hiraoka's name was mentioned. As Daisuke had anticipated, Hiraoka was still running about busily. But in the past week or so, he had begun not to go out very much. He said he was tired and often stayed home to sleep, or else he drank. If anyone came to visit, he drank still more. And he scolded a good deal. He railed all the time. This was Michio's story. I don't know what to do. He has become so violent, so different from the way he used to be, said Michio, as if tacitly seeking sympathy. Daisuke was silent. The maid had returned and was rattling the kitchen door. Presently, she brought in a lamp with a besotted bamboo base. As she went out, she stole a glance at Daisuke's face. Daisuke took the check from his kimono. He placed it as it was, folded in two, before Michio and said, "Okusan." It was the first time he had ever called her Okusan. "The money that you asked for the other day." Michio said nothing. She only lifted her eyes and looked at Daisuke. "I meant to bring it right away, but I couldn't quite arrange it, so it's late. But how about it? Have you managed to settle that affair?" he asked. Then Michio's voice suddenly became low and forlorn. She sounded bitter. She said, "No, not yet. There's no reason why we should be able to clear it up." With these words, she continued to gaze steadily at Daisuke. Daisuke opened the folded check and said, "This much wouldn't do?" Michio extended her hand to take the check. "Thank you. Hiraoka will be glad." He quietly placed the check on the tatami. Daisuke briefly explained how he had obtained the money and added, as if to excuse himself, that carefree as his situation seemed, whenever he attempted to do anything for someone else, he became quite incompetent. He hoped that she would not think too badly of him on that account. Of course, I know that perfectly well. But I just didn't know what to do. That's why I made such an unreasonable request. Michio's apology was sympathetic. Daisuke wanted to be sure. Will that be enough to settle the affair? If not, I'll try something else. Something else? I'll put my seal down and get a high interest loan. No, not that, said Michio immediately, as if to erase the thought. That would be terrible, you know. Daisuke learned that Hiraoka's woes had all begun when he borrowed from ushers. Ushers? Those loans had bounced around and were still playing him. When they first went to Kansai, Hiraoka had the reputation of being a diligent worker, but after Michio's pregnancy, when she began to suffer from heart trouble, he had started to play around. At first, it had not been terribly excessive, and Michio had resigned herself, thinking that it was out of social obligations. In the end, it has exceeded all bounds, and Michio had worried. If she tried to improve matters, her health would deteriorate. If her health deteriorated, his debauchery would be aggravated. It wasn't that he was unkind. It was her fault, Michio protested, but looking lonely again. She confessed that there were times she thought that if only the child had lived, things may have been much better. Daisuke felt that he could guess at the substance of the marital relations hidden behind the financial problems and refrained from asking too many questions. On his way out, he tried to encourage her, saying, You mustn't get so downhearted. Try to be cheerful, the way you used to be, and come over and visit sometimes. Yes, you're right, Michio smiled. Each saw the past of each other's face. Hiraoka had not come home after all. 3 days later, Hiraoka came without warning. That day, a dry wind fanned the cheerful blue sky, and the weather was hotter than usual. The morning papers carried Irie's viewing reports. The large potted clivia that Daisuke had bought had finally shed its petal on the veranda. In their place, the green leaves, almost as wide as a broadsword, were pushing through the stems and growing long. The old, now blackened leaves lingered to glisten in the sun. One of them had by chance been folded into two and drooped sharply about 6 inches from where it left the stem. It was unsightly to Daisuke. He went out to the veranda with the scissors, cut the leaf just before the fall and threw it away. The thick edge seemed to ooze as Daisuke watched. A drop sounded on the veranda floor. A thick, heavy green fluid had gathered at the cut edge. Wanting to smell it, Daisuke poked his nose into the tangled leaves. He left the drip on the veranda just as it was. Then he stood and, pulling a handkerchief from his sleeve, was beginning to wipe the blades of the scissors when Kadono came to announce that Mr. Hiraoka was here. At that moment, neither Hiraoka nor Michio had any part of Daisuke's thoughts. He was under some spell of the strange green fluid, moving in an atmosphere quite apart from the outside world. The moment he heard Hiraoka's name, the feeling was dispelled, and he somehow did not feel like seeing him. Shall I show him in this way? Prompted by Kadono, Daisuke only said, and stepped inside. Hiraoka, who was shown in after him, was already wearing his summer suit. Not only were his white shirt and collar new, but he also had a kind of neat tie that was much in vogue. He was so fashionably put together that no one would have guessed that he was unemployed. After some thought, it was clear that Hiraoka's situation had not progressed at all. Lately, it was useless to even try. That was why he played around like this every day. Or else he stayed home and slept, he said, making a point of laughing loudly. Daisuke said that was probably good too. After that, they passed the time in innocuous gossip. But since it was not so much gossip that came up naturally as gossip designed to skirt a particular problem, they both felt a certain tension at the bottom of their stomachs. Hiraoka would bring up neither the money nor Michio. Consequently, he also said nothing about the visit Daisuke had made in his absence 3 days before. At first, Daisuke had also deliberately avoided the topic and tried to appear nonchalant. But as Hiraoka persisted in maintaining his distance, Daisuke became uneasy. By the way, I went over to your place 2 or 3 days ago, but you weren't there, he began. So I heard. I have to thank you for that. Thanks to you. Oh well. We could have managed without bothering you, but she worried so much we ended up inconveniencing you. Hiraoka offered his cheery thanks. I guess in a way, I've come today to thank you, but she'll probably come herself one of these days, he added, quite as if Michio was entirely a separate entity from himself. Daisuke simply answered, There's no need to go to such trouble. There, the conversation came to a halt. Then again, it slid into areas common to both, but no great interest to either, until Hiraoka said suddenly, There might be a chance I may quit business together. The more I learn about the inside workings of the business world, the more I get sick of it. Besides, I've made a few stabs at it since I got here and I lost all my nerves. It sounded like a confession from the heart. Daisuke only said, Of course. Hiraoka seemed startled by the extreme coolness of the response, but he continued, As I mentioned a while back, I'm thinking of going into the newspaper business. Is there an opening somewhere? Daisuke asked. There's one right now. Looks like I can get it. When he first came in, Hiraoka had said that he was playing around because it wasn't worth trying to find a job at the moment. Now he was saying that there's an opening in the newspaper business that he was considering taking it. It was a bit inconsistent, but Daisuke thought that it could be too troublesome to press the matter and confine himself to expressing approval. That should be interesting, he said. After seeing Hiraoka to the door, Daisuke remained standing on the threshold for a while, drawing close to the shoji. As if to keep him company, Kadono also stayed to watch Hiraoka's retreating figure. Soon he opened his mouth. Mr. Hiraoka is more fashionable than I thought. He almost put us to shame looking like that. Oh, not really. Nowadays everybody look pretty much like that, answered Daisuke, straightening himself. Well, you sure can't tell by looks anymore, can you? You might be wondering who some gentleman is, then he walks back into a shack. Daisuke did not bother to answer and returned his study. The fluid that had dripped from the clavia had begun to cake. Daisuke deliberately closed the study off from the next room and shut himself in. It was his habit to seclude himself after receiving guests. On a day like today, he was thrown off balance. The need for this was particularly acute. Hiraoka had finally moved away from him. Every time Daisuke saw him, he felt as if he were meeting him from a distance, but in fact, it was not just Hiraoka. He felt like this no matter whom he saw. Modern society was nothing more than an aggregate of isolated individuals. The earth stretched boundlessly, but the instant houses were built upon it, it became fragmented. The people inside the houses became fragmented too. Civilization took the collective we and transformed it into isolated individuals. This was Daisuke's interpretation. The Hiraoka who had been close to Daisuke had enjoyed having people weep for him. Maybe he was still like that, but since he never gave any indication of it, it was hard to tell. No, in fact, he made a point of behaving so to repel sympathy. Either he decided to rely on himself and show that he could get through the world alone, or he had realized that isolation was the true condition of the modern society. The Daisuke who had been close to Hiraoka had enjoyed weeping for others. Gradually, he had become unable to weep. It was not that it was more modern not to weep. In fact, he would rather assert that he was modern precisely because he did not weep. Daisuke had yet to meet the individual who, as he stood groaning beneath the oppression of Occidental civilization in the seething arena of the struggle for survival, was still able to shed genuine tears for another. It was less estrangement than aversion that Daisuke felt for the new Hiraoka. He judged that Hiraoka was developing the same feelings. There had been times when the old Daisuke was surprised to recognize such shadows in his own heart, and was extremely saddened. But now the sadness had all but rubbed off. All he did was to stare at the dark shadows. This was the way it really was, he thought. It could not be helped, he thought. That was all. Having fallen to the depths of such isolation, Daisuke's mind was far too lucid to agonize over it. He believed that these were the conditions destined for modern man. Accordingly, when he now considered his estrangement from Hiraoka, he concluded that it was nothing more than the result of their having proceeded along the normal course of all men to a particular point. At the same time, he could not help recognizing that they had arrived at this point more quickly than most because of certain circumstances that lay between them. This had to do with Michio's marriage. It was he, Daisuke, who had counseled Hiraoka to marry Michio. He was not so weak of will as to have regretted it at the time. Even now, when he looked back, his act appeared as an honorable one that lit up his past. But in the course of the 3 years since then, nature had thrust upon the two men consequences peculiar to nature. And the two had had to shed their satisfaction and their glory and bow their heads before this force. Hiraoka came to have fleeting moments of wondering why he had taken Michio. Daisuke heard a voice from somewhere asking why he had urged his friend to take her. Closeted in his study, Daisuke spent the entire day buried in these thoughts. At dinner time, Kadono called. "You have been studying all day today, Sensei. How about going for a little walk? Today is a festival of the tiger, and some Chinese students supposed to perform at the auditorium. Why don't you go see what he has to show? Those Chinese aren't shy at all. They'll do anything. It should be fun." He chattered on by himself. And that was chapter 8. Ooh, it's getting spicy, guys. I have moved my gecko into the new enclosure, and I think she's like still kind of scared, a little bit jumpy just now, but I think she's curious of her new surrounding. Hope she'll get used to it. She'll be more active at night, so she'll probably explore more at night there. Yeah. Oh, story getting a little bit spicy. Okay, let's go. It's chapter 9. Let's go. Okay, I'll change the angle. Okay. Okay, chapter 9. We're currently reading Natsume Sōseki's それから chapter 9. Daisuke was summoned by his father again. He could guess quite well what he wanted. Daisuke had always tried to avoid seeing his father. These days he was more careful than ever to steer clear of the inner quarters of the house, because no matter how politely he addressed his father inside, he was full of contempt for him. Contemporary society, in which no human being could have contact with another without feeling contemptuous, constituted what Daisuke called the decadence of the 20th century. The life appetites which had suddenly swollen of late exerted extreme pressure on the instinct for morality and threatened its collapse. Daisuke regarded this phenomenon as a clash between the old and the new appetites. And finally, he understood that the striking growth of the life appetites was in fact a tidal wave that had swept from the European shores. These two forces would have come to an equilibrium at some point, but Daisuke believed that until the day came when the feeble Japan could stand shoulder to shoulder financially with the greatest powers of Europe, that balance would not be achieved. Yes, I'll hydrate. It's raining really heavily now outside. And he was resigned to the likelihood that the sun would never shine upon such a day. Thus, most of the Japanese gentry, confronted with this predicament, had every day to commit crimes that fell just short of running into the laws, or failing that, they had to commit crimes in their heads. Among themselves, they had to silently acknowledge each other's crimes and make them the subject of friendly banter. As a member of the human race, Daisuke could neither bear to receive nor inflict such insults. Daisuke's father was a complicated case because his reaction to this dilemma was rather unique. He had received a morality-centered education peculiar to the pre-Restoration warrior class. This education was an unreasonable fare that placed the standard of emotional conduct at some distant point beyond the self and refused the eye of truths born out of immediate facts. Nevertheless, his father remained the captive of habit and clung tenaciously to this education. At the same time, he was engaged in business, that activity so prone to attack by the life appetites, and in fact, over the years, his father had been corroded by these appetites. It stood to reason that there should be a vast gulf between his present self and past selves, but he would not admit this himself. He persisted in declaring that he was the same as ever, that he had built his business to its present state with the same attitudes that he had always held. But Daisuke thought that it was impossible to satisfy modern appetites without first limiting the influence of an education valid only in feudal times. Any individuals who dared appease both masters would of necessity suffer great anguish from the ensuing contradiction. One who experienced such anguish and failed to recognize the source was a dim-witted primitive creature. Each time he faced his father, Daisuke could not help feeling that either the man was a dissimulating hypocrite, or a fool deficient in judgment. And Daisuke hated feeling this way. Even so, his own cleverness was of no avail before his father, and Daisuke knew it well. That was why he never yet pushed his father to the limits of his own contradictions. It was Daisuke's conviction that all morality traced its origin to social realities. He believed that there could be no greater confusion of cause and effect than to attempt to conform social reality to a rigid, predetermined notion of morality. Accordingly, he found the unethical education conducted by lecture in Japanese school utterly meaningless. In the schools, students were either constructed in the old morality or crammed with morality suited to the average European. For an unfortunate people beset by the fierce appetites of life, this amounted to nothing more than vain empty talk. When the recipients of this education saw society before their eyes, they would recall those lectures and burst out laughing, or else they would feel that they had been made fools of. In Daisuke's case, it was not just school. He had received the most rigorous and least functional education from his father. Thanks to this, he had one time experienced acute anguish stemming from the contradictions. Daisuke even felt bitter over it. When he had gone home to thank Umeko, he had warned him that he had better go back and pay his respect. Daisuke had laughed and played the innocent, asking if father was home. Even when given an equivocal answer that he was, he said that he was in a hurry that day and left. Today, however, since he had come for the express purpose of seeing his father, he had no choice. When he went around from the inner vestibule to the living room, he found, to his surprise, Seigo sitting cross-legged and drinking. Umeko was at his side. Seeing Daisuke, Seigo said, "How about a drink?" and grabbed the wine bottle in front of him and waving it at Daisuke. There was still quite a bit left. Umeko clapped her hands and sent for a glass. "Guess how old it is?" she said as she poured. "Daisuke would never know," said Seigo, watching his brother's lips. After one sip, Daisuke put down his glass. Instead of appetizers, there were thin wafers on the cake dish. "It's good," he said. "That's why I told you to guess how old it is." "Does it have to age?" "You've really got something here. I'll take one with me when I go." "Sorry, this is all there is. It was a gift." Umeko got up and went to the veranda, where she brushed the wafer crumbs from her lap. "What happened today? You seem very relaxed," Daisuke asked Seigo. "Today is a day of rest. I've been so busy lately, I had to take a break." Seigo put the cigar that had just gone out into his mouth. Daisuke found a match beside him and lit it for his brother. "Dai-san, you're the one who's relaxed," said Umeko as she returned from the veranda. "Have you been to the Kabukiza yet? If you haven't, you should go. It's really interesting." "You have been already? I'm surprised. You're really lazy, aren't you?" "I wouldn't call it lazy. It's just my studies lie in a different direction." "You always talk so big. You don't understand how others feel." Umeko turned towards Seigo. Seigo sat with the reddened eyelids, blankly blowing the smoke from his cigar. "Isn't that right?" Umeko prompted. Transferring his cigar to his fingers with an annoyed look, Seigo answered, "Isn't it better to have him study hard now, so that one of these days when we are poor, he'll be able to save us?" "Dai-san, could you become an actor?" asked Umeko. Without answering, Daisuke put his glass before his sister-in-law. Umeko was also silent as she lifted the wine bottle. "I hear that you were terribly busy recently." Daisuke took the conversation back to the beginning. "Oh, it was too much." Seigo sprawled out on the floor. "Did it have anything to do with the Japan sugar refinery incident?" "It didn't have anything to do with the Japan sugar, but I've been busy, that's for sure." Seigo's answer was never clearer than this. He probably did not care to be clearer than just now, but to Daisuke's ears it sounded no different from his habitual laziness in speech. Thus, Daisuke had always found it easy to plunge into the heart of his brother's answers. "Japan sugar's in a mess, but wasn't there anything they could have done before things came to that?" "Well, maybe. Actually, you never can tell what might happen in this world. Ume, you have to tell Naoki to take Hector out today so he can get some exercise. It's not good for him to eat like this and sleep all day." Seigo repeatedly rubbed his drooping eyelids. "I guess it's about time to go back and get a scolding from father," said Daisuke, putting his glass before his sister-in-law. Umeko laughed and poured the wine. "About a wife?" asked Seigo. "Yes, I suppose so." "Go ahead and take her. Shouldn't make an old man worry so much," he said, and continued more decisively. "You better watch out. There's been low pressure from out this day." Daisuke, who had been about to rise, paused to check. I hope it's not low caused by all this recent activity." His brother, still sprawled out, answered, "Can't say. Even if we look solid like this, there's no telling when we might drag off like those Japan sugar executives." "Don't talk so foolishly," reproved Umeko. "It's probably a low brought on by my loafing." Daisuke got up, laughing. He followed the veranda past the inner garden to his father's quarters, where he found the old man seated before a Chinese desk reading a Chinese book. His father was fond of poetry, and whenever he had the time, he would read collections of Chinese poetry. At times, however, this was an indication of his worst moods. On such occasion, even Daisuke's imperturbable brother avoided him at all costs. If an encounter was absolutely necessary, he took the precautions of dragging Seitaro and Nuiko along with him. Daisuke remembered this when he got as far as the veranda, but thinking that he need not to go quite such extremes, he passed by one room and entered his father's sitting room. His father first removed his glasses. He placed them on the book he was reading, and then he turned his face to Daisuke. He simply said, "You are here." Okay, one moment, please. My gecko can't tell that there's a glass in front of her and she's trying to walk through the glass. I'm sorry for stopping. I'm just observing her right now quietly from where I am. She's exploring her new enclosure. You're here. One might have almost said that his tone was milder than usual. Placing his hands on his knees, Daisuke simply said, Daisuke wondered if his brother had not been pulling his leg. As usual, he was forced to drink some bitter tea and spend a little time in small talk. The peonies were out early this year. It was a season for dozing off to tea-picking songs. At some place where there were wisteria with clusters over 4 feet long. The conversation went far afield. Since this was very much his advantage, Daisuke did his best to prolong it by adding whatever his father said. Finally, the old man seemed to sense that things had gotten out of hand and launched out with a "by the way, Daisuke, I had you come out today because..." After that, Daisuke did not utter a word. He listened respectfully to what the old man had to say. With Daisuke adopting this posture, his father had no choice but to continue at length by himself, as if he were giving a lecture. Over half of what he said was a repetition of previous deliveries, but Daisuke listened as attentively as he were hearing it for the first time. He even spotted 2 or 3 new points in his father's lengthy sermon. One of them was a serious query as to what he, Daisuke, planned to do from now on. This was a familiar demand that Daisuke was accustomed to sidestepping with equivocations. But when the question was to put solemnly, he could not blurt out the first thing that came to mind. One reckless word and he would ignite his father's wrath. Yet, if he were to be honest, he would have to spend 2 or 3 years educating his father's mind before he could make himself understood. Moreover, he had no clear declaration to make about his future in response. Such solemn question. One moment, please. Sorry, I got distracted. Just, just looking really funny now. Sorry. Okay. Where was I? Oh god, where was I? One reckless word and he would ignite his father's wrath. Yet, if he were to be honest, he would have to spend 2 or 3 more years educating his father's mind before he could make himself understood. Moreover, he had no clear declaration to make about his future in response to such solemnity, to such a solemn question. He felt that this was only reasonable for him, but to tell his father that and bring him around to the point of saying "I see" would require an enormous expenditure of time. There's also the possibility that he would never understand. All Daisuke had to do was please him was all Daisuke had to do to please him was to say something about serving the country and serving the world, something grand that could not be linked to marriage. But no matter how inclined he was to self-ridicule, this was simply too stupid. He did not have the courage to let such words fall from his lips. So he had no choice but to reply that in fact he had a number of ideas, but he planned to sort them out first and then consult his father. After delivering this reply, he found it terribly comical, and there was nothing to be done. Daisuke was then asked if he did not want an income sufficient to make himself independent. Daisuke answered that of course he did. His father then proposed that in this case, he should marry Sagawa's daughter. It remained exceedingly unclear as to whether Sagawa's daughter was bringing the money with her, or whether his father was going to give it to him. Daisuke tried to find out, but could confirm nothing. He quit, thinking that there was really no need to investigate to the point. Next, he was asked if he would not just as soon go abroad. Daisuke agreed that would not be bad, but again, marriage seems to be the prerequisite. Is there really such a pressing need for me to marry Sagawa's daughter? Daisuke ended up asking. His father's face reddened. Daisuke had not the slightest intention of angering his father. His current philosophy was that to quarrel with others constituted a species of human degeneracy. To anger another human being, which was one aspect of quarreling, was not so much damaging in itself, but insofar as the angered party's countenance presented an unappealing spectacle to one's own eyes, it was clearly an injury to the precious moments of one's own existence. Daisuke also had his own views about sin, but he did not for a moment believe that because of this he would escape punishment so long as he acted in accordance with his nature. He firmly believed that the punishment dealt one who had killed another human being was contained in the blood that flowed from the dead man's flesh. This stemmed from his conviction that no one could look upon the color of blood spurting forth without experiencing violent turmoil in the sanctum of his heart. Daisuke's nerves were sensitive to this degree. Therefore, when he saw his father's face reddened, he found it singularly unpleasant. But he had no intention of doubly atoning for his sin by doing as his father wanted. This was because in certain ways Daisuke paid enormous respect to his own mental faculties. Meanwhile, his father was heatedly explaining that he was growing old, that his son's future weighed on his mind, that it was a parent's duty to provide a son with a bride, that a parent paid far more scrupulous attention to such matters as bride's qualifications than the groom himself possibly could. The parental kindness might seem like unwanted interference at the time, but the day was sure to come when he would long for such meddlesome advice. Daisuke listened seriously, but when the father's words ceased their flow, he still showed no signs of assenting. Then his father said in a deliberately restrained tone, "Then don't take Sagawa. Go ahead and marry whoever you like. Is there someone you want?" This was the same question that Umeko had posed. Daisuke could not put his father off with this ironic smile that he had used with her. "There's no one in particular I want to marry," he answered clearly. Then his father, in a fit of passion, burst out, "In that case, why can't you think a little about my position instead of thinking about yourself all the time?" Daisuke was surprised that his father had suddenly jumped from his son to the question of his own interest, but the surprise was only over the illogicality and the abruptness of the shift. "If it's so convenient for you, then let me think it over once more," he answered. His father's humor only worsened. There were times when in his dealings with others, Daisuke was incapable of abandoning his sense of logic. Because of this, people often felt that he was deliberately trying to corner them. Actually, there were few who disliked cornering others more than Daisuke. "I'm not saying that you should marry just for my convenience," his father revised. "If you're going to be so argumentative, let me say, just for the record, that you are 30, are you not? You can guess pretty well what society thinks of a man who won't get married, even when he reaches the age of 30. Oh, of course, nowadays it's up to the individual if he wants to stay single. And what do you plan to do if your father and brother are embarrassed on account of it, or if, in the end, something happens that could even touch upon on your own honor?" Daisuke looked at his father's face blankly. He could not tell where the old man thought that he had stabbed him. Eventually, he said, "I do have my vices, of course, but—" His father cut him short. "That's not what I'm talking about." After that, the two were silent for some time. His father believed that the silence to be the result of the blow that he had delivered. Presently, softening his words, he said, "You think it over carefully." Daisuke said he would and retired from his father's room. He went to the living room to look for his brother, but he was not there. When he asked where Umeko was, a maid told him that she was in the parlor, so he went there and opened the door to find Nuiko's piano teacher had come. After greeting the teacher briefly, Daisuke called Umeko to the door. "Are you sure you didn't say something to father behind my back?" Umeko laughed out loud. "Why don't you come in? You've come at a good time," she said, and pulled him over to the piano. And that was chapter 9. One more chapter. Yeah, I think that was it. I think I'm quite tired already. And I'm very distracted by my gecko. Oh, I'm so happy. She's all curled up indeed. Yeah, difficult it is to have a gecko. You have to have like an enclosure big enough for like two different cave system. One is like warm, warm, warm and dry side, and the other side is like cold and humid side. I'm so glad that she's enjoying a new enclosure now. I was so worried that she wouldn't like the cavern that I built for her. I think she does, and I'm very happy about that. Well, it's pretty clear why he's not getting married to anyone. He's just like Michio. His one true love. Ah, well, such is life. Okay, let's go. Chapter 10. Okay, we're currently reading それから by Natsume Sōseki. Chapter 10, それから by Natsume Sōseki. It was the season for ants to crawl indoors. Daisuke poured water into a large bowl and filled it with snowy white lilies of the valleys, their stems still uncut. The delicate, swarming flowers hid the rim's dark pattern. They spilled over the slightest motion. Daisuke placed the bowl on top of the large dictionary. Then he put his pillow beside it and fell on his back, his black head lying just in the shadow of the bowl, so that the scent from the flowers traveled easily to his nostrils. He dozed off, smelling the fragrance. At times, the ordinary physical world affected Daisuke with inordinate severity. In extreme cases, he could not even tolerate the sunlight on a clear day. When this happened, he tried to reduce his contacts with society to a minimum and to sleep, whether it was morning or noon. He often employed a faint, lightly sweet floral scent as a part of the stratagem. If he lay still with his eyelids shut to block out the light, breathing quietly through his nose, the flowers beside his pillow would gradually lure his restless consciousness into the world of dreams. When this tactic succeeded, Daisuke's nerves were renewed, and it became easier than before to maintain his contacts with society. For 2 or 3 days after his father's summons, Daisuke had been bothered by the red roses in a corner of his garden. Whenever he noticed them, they seemed to prick him in the eyes. In such times, he always turned to the leaves of the stone leek flowers at the side of the wash basin. Each of those leaves contained 3 or 4 white streaks that meandered indulgently. Every time Daisuke looked at them, the leaves seemed to have grown longer, the white streaks growing unhampered with them. The flowers of the pomegranate were gaudier and even more oppressive than the roses. Their color was so strong that they seemed to glitter through the greens, and they too were unsuited to Daisuke's present mood. His present mood, as sometimes happened, had taken on an overall tone of darkness. Consequently, when he was exposed to overly bright objects, he found the dissonance difficult to endure. Even the stone leek leaves repelled him as if he looked at them long enough. Moreover, Daisuke began to be beset by a kind of anxiety peculiar to modern Japan. This anxiety was a primitive phenomenon arising from the lack of faith between individuals. Thanks to this psychological phenomenon, Daisuke experienced some severe discomposure. He was a man who disliked putting his faith in gods, and as an intellectual was by nature incapable of doing so. He believed that if people had faith in one another, There was no need to rely on gods. Gods acquired the rights to exist only when they became necessary to deliver man from the anguish of mutual suspicion. Accordingly, he concluded that in those countries where gods existed, the people were liars. But he discovered that the present-day Japan was a country of having faith neither in gods or man. He attributed it all to Japan's economic situation. 4 or 5 days ago, he had read in the newspaper about the policeman who colluded with pickpockets to commit thefts. It was not a question of 1 or 2 cases either. According to the other paper, if the matter was pursued to the bottom, Tokyo risked become unpoliced. Reading the article, Daisuke had only smiled cynically. It stood to reason, he thought, that the meagerly paid police who had to contend with the hardship of existence should turn to petty crime. Daisuke had had a similar cynical feeling about his father's marriage proposal. That was no more than a misgiving, an unfortunate one for Daisuke, who arose from the lack of faith in his father. Daisuke could not feel it dishonorable to harbor such repugnant thoughts, because he fully intended, should his misgiving be borne out by fact, to support his father's behavior as only reasonable. Daisuke has similar thoughts about Hiraoka, but in Hiraoka's case, he allowed that such behavior was the only natural one. He simply could not bring himself to like Hiraoka. Daisuke loved his brother, yet he could not have faith in him either. His sister-in-law was a sincere woman, but Daisuke thought that it would be easier to be close to her than his brother, only to the extent that she did not have to face the vicissitudes of existence. Thus, Daisuke had always dismissed society lightly. And thus, in spite of his extreme sensitivity, he was seldom seized by anxiety. He was himself fully aware of this. Now, for some reason, anxiety had been set in motion. Daisuke guessed that it resulted from physiological changes. That was why he had undone the bouquet of lily of the valley someone had brought him from Hokkaido, immersed them in flour and fallen asleep beneath them. 1 hour later, Daisuke opened his large black eyes. For some time, those eyes were fixed upon one spot. Neither his hands nor his feet were stirred from the position in sleep. He looked for all the world like a corpse. At that moment, the black ant threaded its way up his flannel collar and fell on his throat. Wrinkling his forehead, he pinched the small animal between his fingers and brought it above his nose for inspection. The ant was already dead. Daisuke flicked the black thing from his index finger with his thumb. Then he sat up. There were 3 or 4 others crawling about his knees. He beat them to death with a thin ivory paper knife. Then he clapped his hands. "Are you awake?" said Kadono as he came in. "Shall I serve tea?" Tugging his clothes over his bare chest, Daisuke asked quietly, "Didn't someone come in while I was asleep?" "Yes, as a matter of fact, Mr. Hiraoka's wife." "How did you know?" Kadono's tone was matter of fact. "Why didn't you wake me? You were sleeping so soundly." "But if it's a guest, it can't be helped." Daisuke's tone had become more emphatic. "Yes, but since it was Mr. Hiraoka's wife herself who said it was better not to wake you." "And did Mr. Hiraoka's wife leave?" "No, it's not that she left. She had a little shopping to do in Kagurazaka, so she said that she would take care of that, then come back." Then she's coming again? Yes, actually, she even came into this room thinking that she'll wait till you woke up. But when she saw your face, the way you were sound asleep, she must have thought that you would never wake up. So she went out again? Yes, that's about the way it was. Daisuke laughed and patted his freshly awakened face with his hand. Then he went to the bathroom to wash it. When he came out to the veranda with his head streaming and looked out at the garden, he found that he felt considerably refreshed. The sight of the two swallows flying in the cloudy sky struck him as immensely cheerful. Ever since Hiraoka's visit the other day, Daisuke had been waiting expectantly for a visit from Michio. But Hiraoka's words had failed to materialize. Daisuke did not know whether Michio had particular reasons for not coming, or if Hiraoka was just being conventionally polite when he said that she would come. In any case, he had been feeling an emptiness somewhere in his heart. He had simply viewed this emptiness as one experience among others in his daily life, and made no attempt to do anything about its cause. This was because he thought that if he peered deep into the experience itself, he might find dark shadows flitting about. Therefore, he had avoided taking the initiative to visit Hiraoka. On his walks, his steps had often turned in the direction of the Edogawa River. When the cherry blossoms began to fall, he had crossed the 4 bridges, blown by the evening wind, then crossed back and threaded his way back to the long bank. Now the cherry blossoms were long since gone, and it was the season for shady trees. At times, Daisuke would stand in the middle of one of the bridges, leaning his elbows on the parapet, his face cupped in his hands, and gaze into the light of the water flowed through the thick leaves. Then he would look in the distance where the light narrowed and the woods of Mejirodai loomed high. But he would come home without crossing the bridge and climbing the hills of Koishikawa. Once, at Omagari, he recognized Hiraoka's form about 60 yards ahead of him. He was getting off a streetcar. Daisuke was sure that it was Hiraoka, and he immediately turned away towards the wharf. Daisuke cared about Hiraoka's welfare. He was probably still in the uneasy position of eating without working. Daisuke tried to imagine that Hiraoka might have discovered the key to opening a path for his future, but he did not feel like running after him to find out. He had come to anticipate an inexplicable sort of unpleasantness from his encounters with Hiraoka. Nevertheless, he did not hate him so much that he worried about his situation only for Michio's sake. There was still something in his heart that prayed for Hiraoka's success for his own sake. So Daisuke had come upon this day, still carrying the empty spot in one corner of his heart. It was but a few hours ago that he had asked Kadono to bring him a pillow, and he had ravenously partaken of sleep. If it were possible, he would have submerged his head, which could no longer tolerate the stimuli emitted by a universe brimming with life, deep into a pool and into a blue pool. Daisuke was too acutely conscious of life. At the time he rested his hot head on the pillow, Hiraoka and Michio had barely existed for him. Fortunately, he had been able to sleep pleasantly. But in the middle of that peaceful sleep, he had felt as if someone had noiselessly slipped into the room and noiselessly slipped out. The feeling lingered even after he had awakened and sat up, and he could not erase it from his mind. That's why he had called for Kadono. With his hands at his forehead, Daisuke had been standing on the veranda following the movements of the swallows as they swooped gaily through the faraway sky. After a while, it had become dizzying and Daisuke went inside. But the expectation that Michio would soon come had already broken his composure, and he could neither think or read. In the end, he brought down an art book from the bookshelf and began flipping the pages on his lap. But this too was just a matter of his fingertips turning one page after another. He could not even halfway appreciate the single painting. He came into Brangwyn, and Daisuke had always had great interest in this decorative painter, and for a moment his eyes acquired their usual light as they rested on the painting. It was a representation of a harbor somewhere. In the background, ships and masts and sails were depicted in a large scale, and the remaining space were filled in with clouds in a brilliant sky and bluish black water. In the foreground were 4 or 5 naked laborers. As he looked at those men, their muscles swelling like mountains, with mounds of flesh between the shoulders and back that dipped and met to form eddy-like valleys, Daisuke experienced some pleasure in the power of flesh, but soon the volume still opened. His eyes left the page and his ears pricked up. The old woman's voice sounded from the direction of the kitchen. The milkman went out with hurried footsteps, rattling his empty bottles. With the house as quiet as it was, the noise echoed painfully on Daisuke's sensitive auditory nerves. Daisuke stared blankly at the wall. He thought of calling Kadono to ask again if Michio had said that she would be back, but that seemed so foolish that he hesitated. It was not only foolish, there was no point in being so eager for a visit from another man's wife. If he was going to be so eager, he should have gone over himself to have a talk. Daisuke could not help feeling ashamed of his lapse in logic. He half rose from his chair. He was also well aware, however, of the various factors underlying his illogic, and he thought that for his present self, this condition of illogic was the only reality. There was nothing to be done about it. Therefore, logic had clashed with this reality, but a patchwork of propositions which had nothing to do with him, which insulted his very essence, which was nothing more than mere formality. With these thoughts, he once again settled in his chair. After that, Daisuke hardly knew how he passed the time until Michio's arrival. When the woman's voice sounded outside, he felt a single throb in his heart. Daisuke, whose powers of reasoning were formidable, but was terribly weak in the matters of heart. It was because of his head that was in recent years that he was unable to become angry. His intellect would not allow such an act of self-abasement as anger. But in other situations, he was more than most the unwilling subject of emotions. By the time Kadono, who had answered the door, arrived noisily at the entrance to the study, Daisuke's rosy cheek had lost a shade of their luster. Kadono simply asked, "Will this be all right?" He must have abbreviated his question because it was too much trouble to ask whether he should show Michio into the study or whether Daisuke would see her into the living room. Daisuke said yes, and as if to drive Kadono away, as he stood waiting in a doorway for an answer, stood and stuck his head out towards the veranda. Michio stood where the entranceway joined the veranda, looking hesitantly in his direction. Her face was rather more pale than the last time he had seen her. Daisuke signaled with his eyes and chin for her to come forward, and he approached the door to the study. He noticed that she was breathing hard. "Is something the matter?" he asked. Without answering, Michio came into the room. She was wearing an unlined serge kimono over an underkimono. In her hand, she held 3 large white lilies. Without warning, she tossed them on the table and sank into the chair beside it. Heedlessly of her newly coiffed hair, she pushed her head against the back of the chair and said, "I was so uncomfortable." She looked at Daisuke and smiled. Daisuke was about to clap and send for water when Michio silently pointed to the top of the Western-style desk. There was a glass that Daisuke was used for rinsing his mouth for meals, about 2 sips left. "It's clean, isn't it?" asked Michio. "I drank from it a little while ago, so," he said, picking it up and hesitating. If he tried to empty it from where he sat, one of the glass panels outside the shoji would get in the way. Kadono had a habit of leaving one or two panels shut every day. Daisuke got up and went to the veranda, where he emptied the glasses in the garden and called Kadono. Kadono, who had just been there, was now nowhere to be seen. Feeling somewhat confused, Daisuke came back to Michio and said, "I'll get you some water right away." He went out to the kitchen, leaving behind the glass that he had just now taken to the trouble to empty. He passed the morning room and found Kadono clumsily struggling with the canister of the best tea. Seeing Daisuke, Kadono explained, "I'll be right there, away, sensei." "The tea can wait, I need some water," he said Daisuke, and went to the kitchen himself. "Oh, is that right? She's gonna have water?" Kadono abandoned the canister and followed him. Together they searched for a glass but could not readily find one. Daisuke asked where the old woman was. It turned out that she had gone to buy sweets for the guests. If we are out of sweets, why didn't she get them sooner?" said Daisuke as he turned on the faucet and filled a teacup to the brim. "Well, it just slipped my mind to tell her that we are going to have company." Kadono scratched his head sympathetically. "Then you should have gone," lashed out Daisuke as he left the kitchen. Calm down, Daisuke. But Kadono had more to say. "Well, she said that she had a lot of other shopping to do. Her legs aren't good and the weather's bad, so she shouldn't have gone, but..." Without even looking back, Daisuke returned to the study. He looked at Michio as soon as he crossed the threshold. In her lap, she held with both hands the glass Daisuke had left behind. There was as much water in it as Daisuke had tossed into the garden. Teacup in his hand, Michio stood dumbly before Michio. "What happened?" he asked. Michio answered in her usual composed manner. "Thank you. I had plenty. I drank some of that. It was beautiful," she said, looking back at the bowl of lilies of the valley. Daisuke filled the large bowl almost to the top. From amidst the toothpick-thin, light green stems aligned in the water, the design of the porcelain floated up faintly. "Why did you drink that?" Daisuke was aghast. "It won't hurt, will it?" Michio held the glass out to Daisuke so he could see through it. "It might not hurt, but what if the water had been standing for 2-3 days?" "No. When I was here before, I put my face right up to it and smelled. Then the person told me that it had just been poured from the pail. It's all right. Such a nice scent, isn't it?" Daisuke sat down without a word. He did not have the courage to find out whether she had drunk the water in the bowl for poetry's sake or from physical necessity. Even supposing it was the former, she clearly had not affected an imitation of poetry or novel. So he only asked, "Are you feeling better?" The color had finally returned to her cheeks. Taking a handkerchief from her sleeve, she wiped her mouth and began to talk. Usually, she took the streetcar from Natsume Mae to Hongo to do her shopping, but she heard the prices were a good 10 to 20% higher in Hongo than in Kagurazaka, so he had tried coming out here once or twice. She had planned to drop in the last time too, but she was late and had to hurry home. Today, she had set out early on purpose, but Daisuke was asleep, so she decided to go out and finish her shopping first, then stop on the way home. But the weather had turned bad, and just as she was going up the Waradana, it had begun to sprinkle. She hadn't brought an umbrella, so she hurried, and not wanting to get too wet. But this immediately hurt her. She didn't know what to do. It was so hard to breathe. "But I'm so used to it, so it didn't surprise me," she said, giving Daisuke a lonely smile. "Your heart isn't completely well yet." Daisuke's face was full of sympathy. "It won't ever be completely well, not for the rest of my life." Michio's words did not sound as subdued as the despair in their meaning might have warranted. She tilted a slender finger and glanced at the ring that she was wearing. Then she rolled up her handkerchief and pulled it back in her sleeve. Daisuke gazed at the woman's lowered forehead where it joined her hair. Then, as if she had remembered it, Michio thanked him for the check. Her cheeks seemed to become faintly red as she spoke. Daisuke's keen vision did not miss it. He interpreted it only as shame over her indebtedness and therefore quickly shifted the conversation. The lilies Michio had brought were still lying on the table. A sweet, strong aroma permeated the space between the two. Daisuke could not bear to keep the oppressively heavy smell under his nose, but he could not be so free with Michio as to remove the flowers without asking her. "Where did you get the flowers? Did you buy them?" he asked. Michio nodded silently. Then she said, "Isn't it a nice scent?" She took her nose right up the petals and sniffed to show him. Daisuke involuntarily planted his feet and tilted his body to check. "You mustn't smell so up close." "Oh, why not?" "Why not? There's no reason, but you just shouldn't." Daisuke knitted his brows a little. Michio lifted her face to its former position. "You don't like these flowers?" Daisuke was still leaning back in his chair, and without answering, he smiled. "Then I shouldn't have bought them. It wasn't worth it. I even went out of my way. And on top of it, I ran out of breath trying not to get drenched." The rain began to fall in earnest. The drops collected in the gutter, then flowed out with a rushing sound. Daisuke got up from his chair. He picked up the bunch of lilies and tore away the wet straws that bound them together. "If you're giving them to me, let's arrange them right away." As he spoke, he tossed them into the big bowl. The stems were long, and their ends splattered the water, looking as if they would jump out. Daisuke lifted the drippy stems from the bowl again. Taking a pair of western scissors from the desk drawer, he snipped them about half its length. Then he let the large flowers float among the clustered lily of the valley. "Now that's good." He put the scissors on top of the desk. Michio, who had been gazing at the lily arranged in this oddly careless fashion, suddenly asked a peculiar question. "When did you start disliking these flowers?" Once, long time ago, when Michio's brother was still alive, Daisuke had bought some long-stem lilies and visited the house in Yanaka. On that occasion, he had directed Michio to clean a vase, which she had done with unsteady hands, and then he had painstakingly arranged the lilies himself. When this was done, he had made Michio and her brother turn to face the alcove and admire the flowers properly. Michio had remembered the incident. "You put your nose to them too?" she said. Daisuke thought that it likely that something of the sort that had happened, and had no choice but to smile ruefully. The rain fell in thick sheets. A distant sound muffled the house. Kadono came in saying that it seemed a little chilly. Shouldn't he close the glass doors? While he pulled the panels together, the two sat with their faces turned to the garden. Every one of the green leaves were wet, and a silent dampness blew in through the doors to Daisuke's head. All the floating things in the world seemed to have settled to earth. For the first time in a long while, Daisuke felt as if he had come to himself. "It's a nice rain," he said. "It's not nice at all. I only wore my sandals." Michio's face was more resentful than anything as she watched the raindrops fall from the gutter. "It's all right. I'll get a rickshaw for you when you go home. You can relax." Michio did not look as if she could relax for too long. She looked straight at Daisuke and chided. "You are still as carefree as ever, aren't you?" But the trace of smile hovered at the edge of her eye. Hiraoka's face, which up to now had been hidden in a blur of Michio's shadow, suddenly projected itself on Daisuke's mind's eye. He felt as if he had been stabbed in the dark. Michio was, after all, a woman who walked with a dark shadow dragging behind her, a shadow that could not be easily shed. "How is Hiraoka?" he asked, deliberately nonchalant. Michio's lips tightened a bit. As usual? He hasn't found anything yet? That part seems to be taken care of now. It looks like there's going to be an opening for in newspaper office starting next month. That's good. I had no idea. Then that should do for a while. Yes, I'm quite thankful. Michio's voice was low and serious. Just then, Daisuke found Michio very sweet. He continued, and the other business? It doesn't look like you'll be pressed on that score for the time being. The other business? Michio hesitated for an instant, then suddenly blushed. To tell you the truth, I came here today to apologize about that. As she spoke, she lifted the face that she had to turn away. Daisuke could not bear to show the slightest sign of displeasure that would further distress her gentle woman's heart. At the same time, he avoided saying anything that might anticipate her meaning and force her to become even more apologetic. So he listened. He quietly listened to what she had to say. The 200 yen was to have gone towards the debt as soon as Daisuke gave it to her. But setting up a new household had entailed expenses, and it all began when she used a part of that money for that house. But the rest, she had thought. Then she began to hounded by daily expenses. Though she had not felt good about it, she had no choice. She had used the remainder as the need arose, and now the money was all but gone. Of course, if she hadn't done that, the couple would not have survived to this day. Still, looking back, if the money hadn't been there at all, she probably would have managed somehow. But because it was there, she had used it out of desperation to tide them through emergencies. So the debt, which was the main concern, remained just as it was. Hiraoka was really not to be blamed. It was all her fault. I know I did a very bad thing, and I'm regretting it, but please forgive me. I had no intention of lying and misleading you when I borrowed the money. Michio sounded terribly distressed. I gave the money to you, so however you spend it, no one's going to say anything. If it serves your needs, then that's fine, consoled Daisuke. And he put particular emphasis on the you, letting it linger softly. Then I can feel a little easier at last, was all Michio said. Since the rain persisted, when it came for time for her to leave, Daisuke hired a rickshaw as he had promised. Because it was cold, he tried to put the man's serge wrap over her, but Michio laughed and would not wear it. I don't know why that was so sad. I can only imagine the tension in the room with the two of them. It seems like she cares too about him. Otherwise she wouldn't remember things from the past. Something as simple as that, I guess. But anyway. Yep. How many hours has it been now? 2? I think that's more than enough for today. I'm kind of tired.